Welcome, everyone. Again, I apologize for the delay, but hopefully we'll be able to get moving now. And I want to welcome everybody who is joining us at Marquette, as well as the people who are joining us online. I'm Joan Rosenhauer, and I'm the Executive Director of Jesuit Refugee Service USA. JRS has a commitment to accompany, serve, and advocate for people who have been forced to flee their homes around the world. And we work in 57 countries, serving roughly 1 million people each year. In the US, we have programs supporting people at the southern US border, helping them integrate in communities across the country, and providing support to people detained by the US government. So we will have speakers in both English and Spanish. If you're online, please use the interpretation function and choose your language. Although I wish we didn't need to have a panel like this, given the level of displacement we face around the world, I believe this panel is more important than ever because of its focus on collaboration across Catholic organizations and with others to bring a whole of church response to today's displacement crises. There are 3 key reasons I believe this topic is so important. First, as I'm sure many of you have discussed during this conference, there are 100 million people who have been forced to flee their homes around the world. If it was a country, it would be the 14th largest country out of more than 200. Also, within the Catholic tradition and among other faith traditions as well, our faith compels us to work to welcome and support people who have fled their homes in search of new communities and new homes. For Christians, it's a matter basically of our very salvation, because we're told in the story of the Last Judgment that in the end, our lives will be judged by how we welcome the stranger and help people in need. And a final idea that makes this panel compelling for me involves something I quote often with my colleagues at JRS. I'm told that Theodore Hesburgh, sorry to Marquette, but the former president of Notre Dame, when talking about the culture of Notre Dame, used to say, mediocrity is no way to serve the Blessed Mother. Well, I think we would all agree that mediocrity is no way to serve our refugee and migrant brothers and sisters. We always need to be seeking excellence in the way that we support displaced people. So that's what we're going to explore today. We'll hear some examples of how the Catholic community is collaborating within the church and with others to respond in a variety of ways to current displacement crises. And we'll discuss what we can learn from those experiences to constantly strengthen our efforts. We have a wonderful panel today who bring great experience and credentials. I'm not going to provide detailed biographies. I urge you to go online and learn about them and the wonderful work that they do and the experience they bring to this panel. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to begin by asking the panelists a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up for your questions and comments. If you are joining us online, please put your question or comment in the chat. So I'm going to begin with Father Alberto Ares, a Jesuit who is the regional director for Europe for Jesuit Refugee Service, and he's been deeply involved in the response to the war in Ukraine. Alberto, how are you seeing the Catholic community working together and with others to respond to the massive displacement we're seeing caused by the war?
First of all, thank you, Joan. It's a pleasure. Greetings from Brussels, from Belgium. Also, no, it's a good question. I think I'm going to share my screen and try to explain a little bit what I think that has been like one of the best, I would say, working in progress, no, that we've been doing in Europe, especially with this emergency in Ukraine, no. We call it like this. It's a working group that is called the Catholic Response for Ukraine. Just some small information about this. No, we started our work in March of this year. The war started just 2 weeks before. No, when we started our group. And it's where mostly try to share and to get together the most important organization that we've been working from the Catholic perspective on this humanitarian net, especially around Ukraine, affecting mostly the region, Ukraine, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Moldova, and Romania. our main goal was especially to have a dialogue and to share information that we've been doing, during this, especially these months, these days, in Ukraine and in the neighboring countries. What are the members of the working group? Well, the International Catholic Migration Commission, Monsignor Robert Pitillo, that is been also participating during these days, and it's been a pleasure also to work with him during these months. Caritas Internationalis, Caritas Europe, the Commission of the Bishop Conferences of the European Union, COMECE, the Council of Bishops Conferences of Europe, our team, the Jesuit Refugee Service Europe, and also the Order of Malta. Also, it was the last organization to meet our team, and also with it's been like also organized and sponsored and get together by the Dicastery of Promoting Integral Human Development and the Migrant and Refugee section. Father Fabio Baggio has been also a big support on this matter. Our 5 major areas were like this 5 one, The data gathering and analysis has been getting information from all of our organizations during these days. Humanitarian assistance, really mostly focused on capacity building in protection, and mental health and psychological services, although Karen gathered different things, Advocacy, try to get like a common approach on advocacy, on spiritual care, ensuring the presence of pastoral agents, to cater to the displaced, and communication, also elaborating and implementing communication strategy. We have weekly updates from all of our organization. I invite you also to go to our webpage and to see all the updates that we have every 2 weeks. We have a newsletter that we can also share with you. Also, just is to mention that from our Jesuit perspective, also we try to, in connection with all this, all the work of the Catholic institutions, we try to add also value. And from the Jesuit perspective, we've been working from the very beginning in a common response. We call it the one proposal. I'm not going to explain more. John and some of our companions know a little bit more about this. I think I can stop right now from there, and I think it's been a pleasure, and I think it's been a huge effort. We are just continuing this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. And I just want to clarify that I think for the future discussion, I think you can speak in English now. They sorted that out. But I had a chance to visit our colleagues in Romania, and I can tell you that the work that's being done there on behalf of the Catholic community is remarkable, to welcome so many people so quickly and with such kindness and love and accompaniment and community building, really. My next question is for Vanessa Sanchez de Cañas, and Vanessa is the one holding down the fort for the panel in the room. Thank you, Vanessa. She is the Chief of Staff of Hope Border Institute. As many of you know, Hope Border Institute brings the perspective of Catholic social teaching to bear on the realities unique to our US-Mexico border region. And through a robust program of research and policy work, leadership development and action, they work to build justice and deepen solidarity across the borderlands. So Vanessa, given your work with many Catholic organizations and others on issues and circumstances affecting people at the US-Mexico border, how have you seen the Catholic community bring its various capacities together to provide both programs and advocacy at the US-Mexico border?
Good afternoon to all. That's a good question. I think you can look at it in a couple different levels. If we take the long view, there has been intense commitment and collaboration on the part of the Catholic Church in the region. In Central America and Mexico, there have been enormous efforts on behalf of Catholics, the Bishops' Conference, and religious communities to offer shelters to those heading north to the United States and Canada. There is a large network of migrant shelters and hospitality sites. And there's been long-standing work together on issues of advocacy with the church in the United States. On the border, there are also an incredible numbers of efforts on the US side. Local Catholic charities and legal service providers all along the border, and various efforts have come together in recent years to meet the need. These are also a number of binational efforts, some of them institutional, like Kino Border Initiative in Arizona, like the Hope Border Institute in El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, and less formal efforts in other parts of the border. In our community of El Paso and Juarez, the church on both sides of the border has been part of this broader story. I think you can also look at it from the perspective of the last couple years. In that context, these last couple years have exposed some areas where as a Catholic community, we could do more. In our region in El Paso, the landscape has changed quite dramatically. The burden of hospitality shift almost entirely to Ciudad Juarez overnight with asylum denying policies. Where 5 or 6 years ago, there was only one shelter in Ciudad Juarez, the Catholic shelter. Today, they are closer to 20, and only a few of them are Catholic. There are many more Protestant initiatives and other grassroots efforts. That's good, and I think it's a sign that we need to be working together more. The Bishop of El Paso, Bishop Seitz, work with us to stand up a humanitarian program in Juarez, the Border Refugee Assistance Fund. And we have been able to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in direct aid to support the emergency needs of migrants. Now, there are many efforts. Other religious communities and initiatives have arrived, including John's organization, JRS. But still, there is a lack of coordination and a segmentation of efforts. So it's complicated. While there's been a long history of efforts. The Trump administration, in many ways, was a stress test and put us to work. It showed the straight, but it also revealed some things that we took for granted in areas where we could increase our collaboration across the borders of our Catholic institution and across geographic borders. I think if you look at something like the state and local actions to bus people crossing the border from Texas and Arizona to other states, this process is revealing some of the real gaps in our ability to provide a continuum of pastoral care and support people on the move. Under difficult circumstances, we are doing what we can at the border to welcome and protect. The first two verbs of Pope Francis on migration, but the other two verbs, integrating and promoting, especially asylum seekers crossing the border, remains a challenge and opportunity, certainly. But here we see the stressor on the system and where we need to do more as a church. The environment for people who are migrating has become much more challenging and complex. While the numbers of migrants coming to the border is by no means unmanageable, it's important to recognize that we are historic levels of asylum seekers at the border. At the same time, as a country, we have done a fairly good job, despite the rhetoric, On the enforcement side, hardening the border. The border is much more dangerous place today. The goalposts under the previous administration were moved so far in the direction of enforcement and sealing the border that we are very much fighting against the grain in just getting back to a normal situation where asylum seekers can present themselves for protection. Think of things like remain in Mexico and Title 42. This is a moment of rebuilding. As we move towards some states of normally large numbers of arrivals at the border will again become politically untenable and will need new solutions. These are all areas where we are going to have to work more strategically and more as partners. And we are going to require greater leadership and vision.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. You've lifted us some real challenges that are still facing us despite the efforts to collaborate at the border. And I want to affirm our experience of how terrific it's been to collaborate with Hope Border Institute and to acknowledge that only through their efforts do we get people meds that they need and all kinds of things. So thanks for your work there. But now we'll hear from Chris Kerr, who is the Executive Director of the Ignatian Solidarity Network. As again, many of us know, ISN works in partnership with more than 150 Jesuit universities, high schools, and parishes, along with many other Catholic institutions and social justice partners. Through in-person and virtual programs and campaigns, ISN provides social justice education grounded in Catholic social teaching and mobilizes more than 20,000 network members to take action on timely issues related to migration, care for creation, racial justice, and criminal justice. I do want to acknowledge that we'll only benefit from Chris's insights for a part of our time here today. I think he has a board meeting coming up and his board expects him to be there. So he'll be here for part of our time. But Chris, in light of your work with parishes and schools and universities across the US, on education and awareness raising and advocating on issues related to migrants and refugees, how can we best engage across Catholic and other institutions to mobilize people, to really get people involved in these issues, learning and advocating on them?
Thanks, Joan. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you to all the panelists that are with us and to everyone there at Marquette. I'm joining you actually today from my attic, kind of my COVID quarantine location this week, unfortunately, but grateful to be with you and to be able to address this question. And I just wanted to say that, I want to kind of build on what Vanessa said. I think she did a wonderful job of lifting up both the ways that the Catholic Church, both in El Paso and nationwide, is responding to the realities that people who are migrating are facing in this region of the hemisphere, but also the great challenges and things we need to accomplish. And I think we only need to look to Pope Francis for our call to action on how we engage Catholic communities, right? I think from the beginning of his pontificate, his initial trip to Lampedusa, we learned that encounter, coming to understand the realities migrants are facing by doing so through direct encounter. And we see this time and time again. I think it's, we're almost at the 7-year anniversary of Pope Francis coming to the United States and visiting Washington, D.C. And one of the most memorable moments of that visit for me was when the motorcade stopped in front of the White House during the brief papal parade after the visit with President Obama. And Sophie Cruz, who was then 6 years old, ran out to give a letter to Pope Francis that said, please, when you talk with President Obama, tell him not to deport my mom and dad. And I think that, he models so well for us encounter. So I think, how can we invite Catholic communities, other faith communities to consistently commit to creating opportunities to come to understand the reality of those who migrate, asylum seekers, refugees, immigrants, migrants, to understand the reality through encounter, whether it's encounter with local communities, maybe people even within a parish or school community, as well as coming to understand the realities in other parts of our country, right? If you're not part of the borderland region, how can you, some members of your community spend some time in that region to recognize the unique realities faced there? And we have to remember that how we treat people at our border is a symbolism of how we will treat people when they enter further into our country, right? So I think it's so critical to do that. And then I think we can look to Pope Francis's, 4 kind of calls to action related to engaging in solidarity with people who are migrating. Welcome, accompany, promote, and integrate, and I think they're all rooted in this idea of hospitality. And Pope Francis reminds us that hospitality for us as Christians, and particularly as Catholics, hospitality offered to someone who is migrating is like offering hospitality to Jesus Christ himself, right? So how are we helping our Catholic institutions in our networks to deeply engage in the call of the gospel, to deeply engage in the work of Catholic social teaching? One of the things that we've really tried to do is Joan mentioned those Catholic institutions we work with. We've really tried to help them reflect on what does it mean to be an institution of hospitality, and how do you build a more welcoming community as a university, as an educational institution like a secondary school or an elementary school, as a parish community. And if you're constantly striving to be an institution of hospitality, it'll challenge you. You'll uncover things about your institution that maybe you kind of realize that are not as consistent with who you want to be as a Catholic institution as you thought. But it'll also move you to really standing with some of the most vulnerable people in your campus or parish community, as well as your local community. And then as you do this, then it kind of you have the encounter, you have the commitment to hospitality. It'll encourage you to begin to delve into the more systemic realities within your institution, within your local community, within our national government that marginalize people, right? So it'll encourage institutions to speak out publicly. We've seen so many wonderful examples of Catholic leaders of institutions doing this around the situation of undocumented young people, around the situation of asylum seekers. It'll also people to help Catholic institutions to walk with people in their own communities. In our network, particularly the Jesuit universities have been tremendously committed to walking with undocumented students, and especially DACA recipients, right? And I think that's something that I will say, as someone who's watched that happen over the years, it didn't come as easily for everyone as some. And for some institutions, because of their student populations with lots of students in that immigration situation, that sort of commitment was fairly easy to move towards. But for others, for which maybe they were advocating for 1 or 2 students in their community, a very small portion of their student population, it took a little more conversion, I guess. And I think that's what we're looking for, right? We're trying to help our Catholic institutions really deeply convert themselves to the call of the gospel. And it's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing to do it. And that's, I think, what we're trying to invite folks into. And then, also this idea of integration. How do we ensure that everyone, feels most welcome in their institution, regardless of their immigration background? One of the things that we've been working with is a network of undocumented students across Catholic universities here in the United States. And it's actually, for as much advocacy as there has been by Catholic higher ed institutions, there isn't really a space for students from that unique background to come together as a cohort and have a collective voice for what they hope for their experience and their sense of connection to their Catholic higher education institution. So I think that's something just to think about as well. So again, just kind of in summary, I come back to, what Pope Francis has taught us, right? Encounter, and then these ideas of welcoming, accompanying, promoting, and integrating immigrant people into our communities. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Chris, and thanks for all that ISN does. I think all of the ideas that you shared are realized in the work that you do to mobilize 20,000 people to work on these issues. So grateful for that, and I hope you can stick around for maybe a little more discussion. But my next question I want to direct to Kat Kelly, who is the Senior Director of Migration and Refugee Resettlement Services at Catholic Charities USA. As I'm sure we all know, Catholic Charities USA helps the more than 160 Catholic charities agencies across the US to serve people, regardless of their faith, who are struggling with poverty and other complex issues. CCUSA's advocacy and disaster relief programs, as well as their support for member agencies and their network, provide tangible help and hope to people who need it across the country. Kat, Catholic charities agencies across the country work with USCCB Migration and Refugee Services and other Catholic and secular groups to resettle and provide basic services to refugees and asylum seekers. What are some of the best examples you've seen of the Catholic community collaborating to serve refugees and migrants?
Thanks, Joan. So folks have already been talking about a lot of the really great examples that we've historically done and continue to do inside of Catholic community and networks. And I think something that's really important for us to talk about is how the Catholic community has been able to pivot rapidly to respond to emerging humanitarian crises, not only at the southern border, but also, for example, what happened most recently with Afghan folks who came into the United States. We are just past the year anniversary of folks being brought to the United States for basically a rapid resettlement process that no one was ready for. And so about 73,000 Afghans came to the United States and stayed in military bases, waiting to be resettled through the refugee resettlement pipeline that was not prepared at all. We were able to build, and it's interesting because when we first started to understand what this was going to look like, it was very hard to conceptualize, like, how are we going to resettle 70,000 people in a matter of months? It was, especially after we've seen the resettlement networks just decimated. How do we go about doing this? And one of the first things we actually did was start to model the Afghan response off of the service model that had been pioneered on the southern border: respite, congregate care, right? And so we were able to look at and take that sort of model and start to respond to the needs of Afghans so that they could get off of the bases, right? We were able to, for example, I come from and was at Catholic Charities of Oregon for a long time and helped to develop and lead the Afghan response initially there. And one of the major ways that we were able to start resettling Afghans was a partnership between Catholic Charities, obviously between USCCB, who was acting as the organizational sort of pipeline for these Afghans, and then also our archdiocese, the Archdiocese of Portland, and the local church. And so we didn't have any place to put the number of people who were coming. So we went to the archdiocese and we said, we need help. We're in dire straits here. And through the partnership with the archdiocese, we were able to secure a conference center, and called the Griffin Center, at an extremely reduced rate. And the Griffin Center is right next to, for example, a couple of different Catholic entities, including a school, and then also a parish. And so we were able to resettle the first 40 Afghans coming into Oregon through this conference center that was given to us at an extremely reduced rate by the archdiocese, had the parish who was able to help us provide food, clothing. They hung out with kids, all of these different things. And then we were able to work with USCCB on what would then happen after we were trying to find more permanent housing solutions for these folks. all based off of a model that had been created and pioneered by folks like Sister Norma and Peg on the border. So these kinds of partnerships, tapping into these complex networks, being really creative in where you think, not being afraid to ask other folks in the Catholic network are all really essential components to finding opportunities where they might not otherwise have been or where we wouldn't have thought. And I think being able to model the good practice that we've seen laid down for forever, for decades, inside of Catholic networks to respond to these humanitarian crises is really key. Also partnering with other faith-based and secular groups is really important. LDS played a huge role for a lot of folks in different regions around the country for resettling Afghans, as did other Muslim and Afghan civic organizations, right? So it's just casting a super wide net and engaging folks where you can, supporting the growth of refugee-led organizations as they're trying to support their communities and all of those things. We're able to do these things because we are such a wide network, right? We have so many different options inside of the Catholic network than other communities. And that's why inside of the Catholic network, we were able to resettle, at this point, we resettled 13,300 Afghans. And that doesn't include almost 1,500 Afghan special immigrant visa holders. So I think it was a pretty large feat. I have to give a lot of credit where credit is due to USCCB and also to partners like Airbnb, who partnered very closely with Catholic Charities USA to provide about $1.3 million in housing options for folks so that we could support large families who couldn't stay in a hotel or other kind of traditional congregate settings. You have a family of 13, where are you gonna support them? How can you find housing for them, right? And so we were able to work with them to house. So it takes a whole village, but it's definitely based off of a network that has pioneered really revolutionary practices in humanitarian care.
Thanks so much, Kat. I think there are probably many, many stories that you can share about all the ways that the Catholic community works together across the country to support people in various stages of the migration and resettlement process. I do want to affirm that we had the same experience. We had people from JRS Afghanistan that we had to evacuate and bring to the US, and worked with Catholic Charities and with Migration and Refugee Services. But it was amazing how the colleges and parishes stepped up when we asked, and people said, what can we do? And we do have some answers for them. You guys do, we do. Chris just put something in the chat. And it's wonderful to see how people step up and help when there's a need like that, and remarkable what can get done. And let me just add a reminder, there've been some questions in the chat, but please don't forget to put a question in the chat. Also, Alberto, I want to give you a heads up. I was wrong and the tech isn't working. So you are going to have to speak in English. I'm very sorry about that, but just to give you a little time to prepare. But my next question is directed to Yasmin Jacmouj, who is a graduate assistant at the John P. Schlegel Center for Service and Justice at Creighton University. The Schlegel Center seeks to spark passion for truth and justice and nourish courage and lives of commitment by engaging students in community service, reflection, and action on behalf of justice and sustainability as an integral part of their Jesuit Catholic University education. So Yasmin, as a student at Creighton, you've experienced how Catholic institutions can engage young adults in particular in collaborating across faith traditions and organizations to respond to the needs of refugees, asylum seekers, and other migrants. What have been some of your most impactful experiences?
Thank you, Joan, for the introduction, and thank you everyone else for being here and for caring enough to be here to talk about these important things. I like to joke that Creighton should have given me a second degree for everything that I learned and did as part of my work, both in this office and just outside, as someone who was really interested and cared a lot about this. And really, I owe it all to the very first week I was here in Omaha at Creighton as part of our welcome week that all students go through during their welcoming to Creighton. We have a day of men and women for and with others, in which all students go out into the community or meet with some of our community partners. And so I was fortunate enough to be in a small group that was able to visit one of our local community partners, Lutheran Family Services, which is part of the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services Network, and learn about the work that they were doing in Omaha to resettle refugees, and the work that Creighton students were able to support as part of a weekly service program that the office I now work in established. So right off the bat, my first week on campus, I was like, oh, that sounds like something I want to get involved in and I want to spend my time doing. And it really goes to that point that Chris talked about earlier about encounter and how human relationships, I think, are at the core of everything we do and at the core of why we do what we do. And so following that very first week on campus, I attended weekly service, and through that process, learned more in reflections about immigration as a justice issue, and was later invited to do advocacy with partners like Ignatian Solidarity Network and JRS. And fast forward to where I am now, about 5 years later, I have attended multiple conferences with these groups and have benefited a lot from the formation and the care that they give to students, including this past summer coming to DC for a student leader summit with JRS. And really these times learning, engaging with, and being with other people, students and members of the community who work and dedicate their lives to really doing this work has been like the biggest impact, or has had the biggest impact, and has been one of the most important experiences of my young life. And I think, like I said before, it really goes to the point of human relationship being at the core of what we do and why we do what we do. And now as a grad assistant, it's so exciting for me to get to support other student leaders as they are now facilitating these relationships and building relationships in the community. Because you may or may not know, but Omaha, Nebraska actually has a pretty good reputation for refugee resettlement, has the largest population of South Sudanese people in Nebraska outside of South Sudan. We resettled the most refugees in 2016 per capita than any other state. So there's a lot of work that can be done, and probably more partnerships than you think can be established. But remembering that it's all about that human connection and relationships has really been the biggest and most impactful part of my experiences at Creighton. So thank you.
Great. Thanks for all you're doing, Yasmin. It's really terrific. And I know all of us really want to look at how we can collaborate across organizations and across generations and really bring as many people together, because then our power is stronger in terms of responding to the needs of refugees and migrants and things. I want to shift a little bit to like lessons learned. And I'm going to go, I think, to Vanessa first, and then Alberto, I'll go to you next, so you can be thinking in English about what you want to say. And maybe just, Vanessa, what can we learn from our experiences? You already started us down that path, which is why I wanted to start with you about some of the gaps and what Pope Francis has lifted up as in terms of the 4 pillars of supporting migrants and refugees. What are some of the gaps, and what can we learn from what we've done in order to help us do even better in the future?
Well, the first thing is just that we need to collaborate. We need to work together to increase the impact of our work, to better leverage resources, to amplify our collective voice, to coordinate research. We need to work as partners across physical borders and across the architecture of our different agencies. I think if there's been a silver lining to the past several years, is that as a country, we have begun to listen more to the experience of border communities. And as a border communities, we have begun to develop our voice more. And that's true in the church as well. We are including the borders perspective more at the center of pastoral strategies or advocacy, and the broader debates around immigration. That's a good thing, and we need to deepen that. In the past, the bishops largely drove and coordinated the Catholic community's work on migration. That's important, and there are more actors involved now, and efforts are less centralized. And it's important for us to discern new ways of exercising collective leadership to move forward together as faith-based NGOs, religious, and agencies. I think the other thing we have to do is recognize the need to get out of a crisis mentality. We are good as Catholics at responding to crises, but we need to be more strategic. We need to recognize that arrivals at the border will be with us for a while, for more than one administration under both political parties. We need to begin thinking long-term. We'll need new solutions. How can we provide real pastoral care to those arriving to the border in a coordinated way that doesn't end when folks leave the border, but begins there? How do we welcome them into our parish communities? How do we break down the walls between the wonderful work of our legal service providers and Catholic charities, agencies? And what happened in the parish? We need to think about how we are integrating and promoting our communities in the interior of the country and connect work at the border to that work. We also need to move the conversation upstream, away from crisis, towards focusing on drivers and root causes, as we heard yesterday, towards building new forms of protection that responds to today's drivers and not yesterday's, like climate and gender violence. We need to listen and put the experience of people at the center of our reflection. You know, one final thing is that the next year marks the 20th anniversary of Strangers No Longer, the pastoral letter of the US and Mexican bishops on migration. That moment sparked an intense period of joint action and advocacy across the region. Migration is a regional phenomenon. We will only address it together as a region. Our programs need to be regional. Our strategies need to be regional. Our advocacy needs to be regional. I think we need to use this anniversary to think about renewing our cooperation and collaboration, to work together, to provide protection to more people, and to overcome some of the harsh politics which have only criminalized more people and militarized our borders, but haven't done anything to solve problems. We, people of faith, can be people of vision and change makers.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. My goodness, I was writing like crazy, listing all the things that you're suggesting, which are really wonderful ideas. And so now I'm going to turn to Alberto. I'm guessing that some of the things Vanessa mentioned, like getting out of a crisis mentality, thinking long-term, think regionally. Many of the things she mentioned would also be things you have learned in the process of responding to the war in Ukraine. But share with us your thoughts about what lessons can be learned that can help us be even stronger at working together on these issues.
I think it's been it's a really good question. You know, at the very beginning, while I've been really involved in the emergency, visiting the countries, Poland, Ukraine, Romania, Slovakia, Hungary, it's just to try to be a little bit, to try to think the lesson learned. I think something that came in the conversation also, Pope Francis is always in the background, in most of our work, especially in Europe. And last days from Kazakhstan also with this, all the announcement, all the things that he's been, and also some of the things that Chris, Vanessa, Kat, Jasmine was also mentioned, borders, build bridges, reception, encounter, hospitality, integrations. when I was just getting these things, also I got like some kind of, I would say 10 lesson learned from our experience in the response from Ukraine, from this Catholic response, working together. First of all, this lesson is, the first is to realize the great expertise of our organization in working closely with the needs of the most vulnerable people, in the area. I think sometimes we go through these things in a different, but I think it's important to realize what this great expertise, and I think I feel proud of this, of being close to the most vulnerable people. Probably the second, the second lesson is that I realized, and I visited really committed teams and qualified professionals together with a large group of volunteers who have thrown themselves into the reception and accompaniment of refugees, especially in terms of volunteers, families, parishes, well, from different denominations, people close to the border try to help. I think it's been also really amazing. Probably the third is the importance of believing in coordinated work and not operating in isolation. I think most of us, we do a really good job, but sometimes we try to make it by our own. And to believe and to see the importance, I think, is another lesson learned from these months. Also, the importance to have an authoritative leadership, a leadership that can coordinate and encourage, even if it's remain in the shadows. It happened mostly in this emergency also, to have like a leadership that can help us also through all of our institutions. Also, the importance of having some resources freed up to facilitate our coordination. It's been also really, really important. Maybe like the sixth lesson learned is that all organizations and members have partial capacities. Some of them, they have a lot, but alone, or we cannot provide a holistic response in Ukraine. It's been like many people, million people, moving around with a lot of necessities. And just to realize how important it is to work together. Another lesson learned is the great advantage of a coordinated response is that together we can offer an overall view and a much articulated response. When we met together in March and we share all this information and also see in the different places, and how can we also articulate like a comprehensive response, and also to work on the field all together, it's been, I think, amazing. Another lesson is that when we present ourselves in an articulated and integrated way, donors and benefactors are more willing to commit to the emergency. We gain credibility. And this is something that probably you say, well, it's true, but sometimes we don't realize how important it is also to connect the people that want to help with also the necessities of the refugees. The last two lessons learned, we need to grow not only in dialogue and in general collaboration, but also in a more articulated common projects, in the field, especially in this time, that we are moving in a different stage, also in the war in Ukraine, and also in the different responses, around the neighboring countries, especially, and in all Europe. Probably the last one is that coordinated and common work roots us in the gospel values of communion and service to the most disadvantaged and the most vulnerable people. And something also, just maybe to mention and to finish, we have much more to learn, as unfortunately the response to the emergency in Ukraine still persists. So many things going on now in Ukraine and the neighboring countries, in all the response within us. So yeah, thank you, John.
Thank you, Alberto. That was another terrific list. And I hope we can have a transcript so we can kind of capture these ideas that I think really challenge all of us, but encourage us and give us direction. Kat, I'm going to turn to you next and ask, you can answer some of what the others have been answering, but I'm especially wondering from your experience with Catholic Charities USA and agencies, what should we be looking to do in the future as a Catholic community to build a more welcoming context in our country, which we all know is a real challenge?
Thanks, Joan, for that question. I think everyone's talking about it, right? We need more collaboration, we need coordination, and we need to understand that it's not just one entity or 2 entities or 10 entities who are going to kind of create a really lasting solution. We have to find different ways to coordinate across networks and across communities and things like that. I want to talk about the example of a pilot project that's taking place right now called The Borders Everywhere, which is a collaboration between Catholic Charities USA, USCCB, Center for Migration Studies, and Clinic, as well as 11 Catholic Charities member agencies across the country, including 4 border agencies and 7 agencies in the interior. And what we were able to do with this project was create kind of a universal intake at the border for folks who are coming through some of the Catholic Charities member agency shelters, so that the information of migrants is put into a database, a secure, very secure database, the USCCB database, which is used for refugee resettlement. Folks consent to share their information with Catholic Charities at the border, which is then transferred to a Catholic Charities in the interior, where a social worker is waiting for those folks. And inside of that social work option that we're working on providing to folks, we really work on supporting some of the first initial steps and services that folks need when they come into their welcoming community, into their community of destination. So often that's housing, that's healthcare, that's food, and also immigration legal services. Folks need an attorney. They're not guaranteed an attorney. And so we work with them on finding an attorney and also making sure that they understand how to comply with their immigration court requirements so that they can comply with those requirements and ultimately win their case. We know that we'll be working with these folks, and we do work with these folks for many, many years. The average case right now is lasting between 5 and 7 years. So that welcome and encounter on the border is so essential to the initial health and well-being of folks. And then the warm handoff to the social worker in the interior is essential for not only ongoing wellness and stability, but also making sure that folks get to stay. We know that holistic encounter is a collective pursuit. We all have to be part of that together. We have to be willing and able to kind of grow and stretch in ways that we're not necessarily comfortable with or that we haven't done before, and think kind of outside of the box around coordination, so that we can be co-conspirators in safety and empowerment, right? We're not saviors, we're none of those things. We're here working in partnership and allyship with folks. And the best way we can do that is to understand that humanitarian response is actually quite scientific. And we've done this before. We know how to do these things. And so we can take these blueprints and we can put them onto a new situation, and then we can adapt and modify according to what the current situation is so that we can rise to the occasion. And so with the Borders Everywhere, we use some of these larger Catholic, national entities where they really have a lot of strengths. So USCCB with their, expertise in creating the refugee pipeline and managing that data. Our folks at Center for Migration Studies, who are research and data analysis experts. Our folks at Clinic, who are the immigration legal experts. And then the individual expertise of the organizations on the ground, right? And so taking all of that expertise, mixing it all together, making sure you have client consent. Obviously, nobody gets enrolled in this program without client consent. And then serving them to the best of our ability so that they can stay. Right now, we have 110,000 people enrolled in the Borders Everywhere. And we continue to work on finding capacity options so that we can help folks to stay in a healthy way, to stay in a way that feels safe to them, and to stay in a way that they feel empowered to understand the very complex systems that they have to navigate, in addition to all of the traumas that they're carrying with them, but they're also bringing a lot of strengths. And so that's a project that's it's been active since 2020. And we know that there's other programs like that around the country. So keep your eye out for those kinds of things and folks trying to figure out how to mash those kinds of programs as well. So thanks, Joan.
Great, thanks, Kat. And she and I are talking also because our migrant accompaniment network is really more volunteers, like somebody who's willing to help a newcomer figure out how to open a bank account, or enroll their child in school, or whatever it might be. And then the professionals with Catholic Charities are critical, and the network of Catholic Charities is critical. So I think we can build that welcoming community in a lot of different ways. Yasmin, I want to circle back to you and just ask you, all of these groups, I think many of the groups represented here would love to engage more young adults in this process. And so we'd love your advice. What advice would you give to these organizations for engaging students and others on college campuses in issues related to forced displacement?
This is a lovely question, and I could probably spend hours just talking about this alone, but I will try and keep it snippy. I think my answer is going to come in the form of a quote to start from Father Kolvenbach, who said, "When the heart is touched by direct experience, the mind may be challenged to change." This is one of my favorite quotes, probably of all the Jesuits, because I think it really speaks again to what I was talking about earlier about that human connection. And students, I mean, all people, but I think especially students, college, high school, whatever, are wanting to connect more with people, because behind every ginormous issue, you can't just look at the numbers. You can't just see like that 100 million number, because that's like, how do you even conceive of 100 million? That's like close to 1 in 3 Americans. That's one way you can look at it. But it really helps to have that human connection behind it. So I think facilitating programs like weekly service opportunities with local partners, like the refugee simulation, which is, I think, based on an Ignatian Solidarity Network model, or Catholic Charities has similar things as well, to like get people that experience of learning from, hearing from, being with people who have migrated is so important. And knowing that kind of many organizations should, in wanting to take this first step, should kind of consider this question of how can we support movements and groups in their own self-development and flourishing, because at times I think not best practices for community engagement have happened, where groups come in and say like, well, we think this is your problem and this is how we think we want to do it and fix it. But having this framework, instead of starting with the end in mind, and knowing that communities know themselves and their problems best, is like really the best framework for starting any program. So I think going where you're asked and not just showing up is really, really important, as well as building next steps for any engagement. So I think with any program, like I came back from the Student Leader Summit with JRS this summer, and immediately enrolled in their advocacy updates so that I could know, every week or however often they send out those emails, what advocacy asks for coming up. And then come August, when the Afghan Adjustment Act was introduced in Congress, we had all 30, 40 of our students that work in our office do advocacy, because we had seen that it was recently introduced. We had the script from JRS. It was so easy to kind of then implement that. So I think having these actions is really important, but always having those next steps, and knowing that students have a lot of opportunities and are, at times overwhelmed with the amount of opportunities they have. So keeping it kind of simple can help a lot of new students. So finding whatever it is that they connect with is really important, whether it's service, whether it's justice, and having that first ask be kind of small, and then you can kind of reel them in and get them more involved, and hopefully they can end up in positions like me, where I'm now facilitating these experiences for other students. So I can keep talking about this, but I will also add my email into the chat so people can reach out directly with more follow-up questions. But I hope that's some ideas.
Yeah, that's terrific, Yasmin. Thank you very much. And thanks for all you're doing. It's terrific to engage the people on the campus there at Creighton and things. We have a couple of questions and just a couple of minutes for questions, but I do want to give a shout out to Sister Rose Therese Nolta, who has been keeping the chat going quite effectively here. Thank you, Sister Rose Therese. And but I want to, so what you'll find in the chat if you haven't looked is that there are a lot of questions about models for engaging parishes and universities and things, and there are some answers about where you can find more. And so I encourage you to take a look at that. But there were two things that came up that I would really like to lift up. One is, and maybe if we don't have time for both, I'll go straight to this one first, the question of advocacy points. And you had just been mentioning, you know, some of it, Yasmin, with the Afghan Adjustment Act. But I think what are, you know, the question is, what are the advocacy points that we need to be working on right now? And so let me invite Alberto. You may not know what the U.S. Congress is doing so much, but I'm gonna go to Kat and Vanessa and Yasmin to see how you would answer that question about what are the key advocacy points that we should be addressing now.
So, you know, Yasmin mentioned the Afghan Adjustment Act. Absolutely, we need to be supporting the Afghan Adjustment Act, and we also need to be supporting. Getting more EFSP dollars, the Emergency Food and Shelter Program, which is the humanitarian pool, is the federal dollars that we're able to use to provide humanitarian response for migrants. So it's used primarily by border providers, but it can also be used in the interior to serve migrants through onward travel supports and short-term housing options, food, those types of things. It is currently it's $150 million was the last appropriation. And we really, really need to continue to have access to those dollars. So if folks, you know, the reality is that folks leaving the border region are going everywhere in the country. And we need to be able to serve those folks everywhere in the country. And so having access to those dollars is going to be a really important advocacy opportunity for folks, as well as, again, Afghan Adjustment Act.
Thank you. Vanessa?
I think we have to continue working together and trying to be like, as today I hear to say that we are all in the same boat. So that's the form that we can make advocacy, being together, working together like as a partner. So I think that that's the best way to make advocacy each one of us.
Thank you. Yasmin?
So we have an advocacy team actually within our office, so they would probably better suited to addressing this question, but the Afghan Adjustment Act, I believe, is still on the floor of Congress. I'm not sure exactly where it is sitting, but that is an absolutely huge one. I think that there is some also legislation still around Title 42, which JRS advocacy page actually probably has the best resources on that at the moment. But that's another huge one that is kind of going back and addressing some of these issues we've seen along our southern border and hoping to correct some wrongs that I think have happened in the past. So Title 42, the Afghan Adjustment Act. I think there might also be something related to DACA currently in the works. So I know that advocacy research is not the easiest thing, but I think there's networks like JRS, like ISN, who do that hard work behind the scenes already. And so it's just a matter of finding it and being ready to call and bug your representatives so that they listen to you.
Great, thank you. I'll just add a little bit to this one. So yes, definitely the Afghan Adjustment Act, and the latest strategy is that it is to really encourage that it be tied to the continuing resolution, which is what Congress does every year to kind of keep the government going when they can't really, you know, focus on a whole new plan and budget and appropriations and everything. So then they just do a continuing resolution, but there can be things added. And right now the push is to get the Afghan Adjustment Act added to that, which will allow people who came from Afghanistan to have a path to permanency here in the US. Right now, many of them do not. Also, there's messages to the administration around how they're undoing the migrant protection protocols that remain in Mexico. As you said, Yasmin, Title 42, there are various pieces of legislation that could either advance it or not. The one other thing, well, two things. Somebody asked, I think, about the number coming out in September, sometime soon, which is the presidential determination, which will identify how many refugees, the max number of refugees that will be allowed into the US. Our capacity, sadly, hasn't caught up with the numbers yet. And so we're not bringing in as many as the presidential determination would allow even this year. But we want to keep growing that number and getting that number to be more robust so the U.S. can return to a key role in resettling people. So take a look on our website. We also have some things about that. And then finally, one thing we work on in appropriations is education in emergencies, because when children are forced to flee their home because of war or natural disaster, they have experienced real trauma, and their lives seem to just be falling apart wherever they are around the world. And if we can get them back in a classroom, it feels like there's some normalcy in their life. And it feels like the world is telling them, you have a future and you have to prepare for it. And so we're going to make sure you get education as quickly as possible after you've been forced to flee your home. And so the US has done a lot of work to support financially Education Cannot Wait and the Global Fund for Education. We also have stuff about that on our website, but it's a critical need for forcibly displaced children. I think we've run out of time, but I do want to thank our panelists. I hope you found their comments interesting as I did, and just grateful for all of them and all of you who joined us. And hopefully we've been sharing a few email addresses. We can continue the conversation and continue to work collaboratively across the Catholic community to respond to the needs of forcibly displaced people in the US and all over the world. Thank you all very, very much.
Everyone. I just wanted to announce that we're going to begin our next breakout session in the 3 ballrooms. The session will begin at 2:40. We're going to be hosting workshop 1 in this room titled Catholic Responses to Human Trafficking. Workshop 2 will be in ballroom AB to my right, and that's called Forming Catholic Leaders on Catholic Social Teaching on Migration, the Needs and Gifts of Immigrants, and the Church's Work with Immigrants. And then finally, we'll be hosting workshop 3 in ballroom CD to my left, titled Honoring the Legacy of Mother Cabrini and Bishop Giovanni Battista Scalabrini in the Church's Work Today with Migrants. So take a quick break and we'll begin those sessions shortly.
Okay. Bye-bye, Jasmine.
Bye. Ciao.
Bye-bye. Ciao, ciao.
Hi, Father Leonir.
Hi, Michelle. Hi, Sister Barbara. To see you.
Greetings, Padre, from Michelle in Michigan.
Hi, Michelle. Good to hear you.
Sister Barbara and Father Leonir. People, I think, are still filtering in the conference room. And so we'll give it about 2 more minutes and then we'll go ahead and start.
Okay, thank you. And Michelle, I don't know if you received the email that I sent to you.
Yes, that there won't be a video. That's okay.
Yeah, no video. Yeah, they are still working on this. We are in the middle of a storm of the preparation of the canonization of Scalabrini in 1 month.
Yes.
We need to organize everything in 1 month, but in any case, yeah.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I know that we are up on the screen there in person, and there are a few folks who are joining us virtually. My name is Michelle Sardone, and I am the Deputy Director of Programs for CIII, which is the Catholic Legal Immigration Network. And for today's panel, we're very lucky to have 2 great panelists. The first is Father Leonir Chiarello, who is the Superior General of the Congregation of the Missionaries of St. Charles, or the Scalabrinians. And then we also have Sister Barbara Staley, who's the General Superior of the General Council of the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Hello to you both. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a brief introduction. So this year during the conference, we thought it would be a good opportunity for celebration. This year marks the Jubilee year, the 75th anniversary of the canonization of Mother Cabrini. And we also are having some exciting news that next month, Blessed Scalabrini will be canonized. And so we wanted to use and talk about their work and their example of working with migrants in their communities and how we are currently living that legacy, and what you as participants in this workshop, what you can be doing in your communities to also further their legacies as well. So I just wanted to start off by telling you a little bit about my connection to both of these saints. The first is I grew up in New York City, so I know I don't sound like it anymore, but my mom, her family was from Costa Rica, and so she lived in Upper Manhattan and attended Mother Cabrini from K all the way through 12. And so when she arrived at kindergarten, she didn't speak English, and it was the sisters at the school that really first welcomed her. That is where she made her first friends who spoke English, and those who, one of those who is currently my godmother. And then every summer we would return to the shrine in New York. And one of the things that I can most remember was the beautiful mosaic that was behind the altar there at the shrine in New York. When I was young, it was not perfect and falling apart, and then I know in the last few years that they've restored it, and it is beautiful. And it has the pictures kind of the journey of the life of Mother Cabrini. And in looking at it, it sort of told the story of my family as well. Both my mom's side of the family, who was from Costa Rica, and my dad's side of the family, who was from Italy, and their journey about, coming through Ellis Island and first seeing the Statue of Liberty. So Mother Cabrini has always been a big part of my life. And then I would say Blessed Scalabrini has been more recently my connection. Before working at Clinic, I worked at Hogar Hispano, which is the Immigration Legal Services Program of Catholic Charities for the Diocese of Arlington. And I worked with many recent arrivals from Central America while I was there, and many spoke of the Casa del Migrante, or some of the shelters that they encountered on their way to the US. And now at Clinic, we had a border program that was in Ciudad Juárez, and the Estamos Unidos project, and many of the individuals that we helped through that project as well had always spoken about the Casa del Migrante, which was a Scalabrini ministry. And so I'm very excited to be here today and to be the moderator. And so we're hoping that this will be a conversation. I have a few questions for both Father Leonir and for Sister Barbara. So first, let's start off with Sister Barbara. There's a full bio on the website for the conference, but I did want to share a little bit about Sister Barbara, that the missionary sisters of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, that they're present on 6 continents and in 16 countries. And prior to Sister Barbara's term as General Superior, that she that included her apostolic ministries about founding the Cabrini Ministries in Swaziland. And then also that Sister Barbara worked for 10 years in Chicago, caring for undocumented immigrants there, and helping them to access healthcare and social services, as well as providing direct mental health care. So Sister Barbara, we're so happy to have you here with us today. Could you start us off, for those who are both in person and online who may not know much about Mother Cabrini? Could you tell us a little bit about her work, and her charism?
Good, thank you. Thank you for the introduction and your warm words about Mother Cabrini. I'd love to know who your godmother is. Just one clarification before I get started about Mother Cabrini. My term as the General Superior after 8 years finished in July. So I am not the current General Superior of the Missionary Sisters, but I do come with that history of 8 years being in that position. Regarding Mother Cabrini, look, there are many stories about Mother Cabrini, and there's so much that can be said. And so to try to encapsulate the life of this woman in a few minutes is no easy task. first of all, for those of us who are North Americans, I think it's important that we recognize that she was the first American citizen who was canonized a saint. And she had the renown in this country and throughout the world, the same sort of position that Mother Teresa does and did. She was well known, she was well respected throughout the church and by the citizenry and recognized for many of the good work she did. There's a lot of narrative about Mother Cabrini, and I think that one of the things that does not get stated well enough is that Mother Cabrini was driven by her passion for Jesus. She wanted to spread God's love. And so she did a lot of great things. And that's what often gets told, is about all the great apostolic works that she did. But the foundation and the root of that was her commitment to the Lord and her desire to spread God's love throughout the world. So our connection with the Scalabrini priests goes back to Mother Cabrini and Monsignor Scalabrini. They were great collaborators, and Monsignor Scalabrini and Cabrini came from the same region of Italy. It's only separated by about 15 miles. And Cabrini always dreamt from the time she was a small child of being a missionary. And there were no women missionaries in that era. There was no congregation of women religious called missionary, but she wanted to be a missionary. And she dreamt of going to those who had been unevangelized, those who had never encountered Christianity. And her dream was always to go to China. But Monsignor Scalabrini had this passion for the plight of the Italian immigrants, and continually impacted her and impacted the Holy Father of the time to influence Cabrini to change her direction. And in obedience to the church and to the hierarchy of the church and her great faithfulness to the Holy Father and her deep respect for Monsignor Scalabrini, she accepted the new call to go to the New World instead of to Asia and to serve the immigrant population in the United States. She embraced that fully, and once she did it, it was a full embrace. When she landed in New York City, there was strong collaboration between her and the priests who were founded by Monsignor Scalabrini, who neither the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart nor the missionaries Father Leonir had their names at that time, but we know who those congregations were. Initially, clearly she served the Italian immigrants by setting up schools and catechesis and worked to go into hospitals and orphanages. But it needs to be recognized that within her first month of being in New York City, she was serving other immigrant populations, including the Irish at that time. And when she went to Denver, and you realize the travel at that time was maybe by train, by stagecoach. The biggest population that was served out in Denver were Mexican immigrants, and obviously inclusive of Italian immigrants. But she was much bigger than only serving Italians. And I think that that's the narrative that I think needs to be corrected and spread out, because her love was much broader than a narrow group of people. It was, she wanted to bring Jesus to the world. In her lifetime, she established 67 institutions. Most of those would be schools, as well as hospitals and orphanages. She traveled to several countries in her lifetime: Panama, Nicaragua, Colombia, Argentina, Brazil, England, France, Spain. So there was this zealousness that she had, this ardor that she couldn't do enough to bring the love of Christ to the world. She obviously was a tremendously bright woman, or she would not have been able to do and to interface with the many different people that she interfaced with. So she could interface with high governmental officials, as well as those who were uneducated and incapable of fending for themselves. So I think that that's kind of a brief encapsulation of Cabrini, but a woman ahead of her time, who understood herself as a woman and her autonomy, and certainly the desire to enculturate and to help those who had left their countries out of desperation to become good citizens and good participants in the new societies where they found themselves.
Thank you, Sister Barbara. And we're also lucky to have with us today Father Leonir. He, as I mentioned, is the Superior General of the Scalabrinis, and they serve migrants and refugees and seafarers and people on the move in 34 countries and on 5 continents. So in addition to serving as Superior General, Father Leonir is a member of the Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Life and Societies of Apostolic Life, and was appointed by Pope Francis. So he has joined the North and Central American Task Force with a special mandate to lead on the role of faith-based institutions in solutions to address the issues driving migration in Central America, which is so important to our work, especially here in the US. Of those of us who work with migrants. So Father Leonir, the same question for those of us today who may not know as much about Blessed Scalabrini, could you tell us a little bit about him, his work, and his charism?
Thank you, Michelle. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the Center for Migration Studies for inviting me to join Sister Barbara to share the work of Scalabrini and Mother Cabrini with the church, with the migrants, engaging the church, society, and all the political and social actors. As we know, facing the gigantic phenomenon of migration in the end of 19th century, as Sister Barbara said, Scalabrini and Cabrini, they were, we can call them pioneers. They were main creators of a practical and comprehensive interventions in favor of migrants, people leaving their countries. And in addition of engaging themselves, they were leaders engaging the church and engaging society in this pastoral care for migrants. And this very hot time in Europe and other countries, we can say that they planted some trees that today we are still protected of the shadows of the institutions and the charism that they planted. They were visionaries, they were very committed, and especially as Sister Barbara said, Sister Cabrini and Bishop Scalabrini, their dreams were to be missionaries. And when Scalabrini, his dream was to go to India, and his bishop said, your India is in Italy. And he started as a professor and a rector of the seminary, as a pastor in a parish, and then when he became bishop in the young age of 36, he started to express his missionary charism with the local people, with the poor, with the deaf, with the women working in bad conditions, but especially when he realized that migrants were living in millions to the Americas, he realized that his dream to become a missionary was opening up the border of his diocese to the world. And we can summarize his charism, his legacy for us today in 5 main aspects. First is his sensitivity and his commotion with migrants. He was touched with the encounter. All his initiatives had an encounter in their origin. And he was a very sensitive man, and he didn't remain indifferent for the situation of millions of migrants and the pain of these migrants live in the country. And his sensitivity and commotion with migrants and their families is a legacy that reminds us the urgent need to counteract the culture of indifference with migrants that characterize our societies, as Pope Francis stressed so many times. Because his sensitivity, his commotion is a legacy for us today to counteract this culture of indifference. The second is his systemic comprehension and interpretation of migration phenomena. He was a pioneer in promoting a systematic sociological interpretation of migration. And we can say one of his legacy is the network of Center for Migration Studies that we have today as the Scalabrinians. He was, for example, when we sent the first missionaries in Brazil, in the United States, he was all the time writing letters to them saying, please send to me the numbers of people, what are their conditions? And he was a pioneer of this sociological interpretation, conducting surveys, analyzing the causes of migration, identifying social and legal mechanisms involved in the phenomena, observing the cultural impact and the transformations of the identities, and grasping the religious dynamics of the phenomenon in all these way of moving people from one country to another. And in this perspective, Scalabrini predicted that migration was not a circumstantial event of his time, but a structural phenomenon of modern societies. So the second aspect is his systemic comprehension interpretation, seeing that is a structural phenomenon of today's society. The third aspect is his holistic and comprehensive vision of migration, as we mentioned, recognizing the human, social, economic, political, cultural, and religious dimensions. And on the other hand, from a theological perspective, he recognized migration as a God's providential, is an instrument of God's providence through which God is guiding humanity to build a human family. This is an interpretation of migration from a providential perspective that reveals a Scalabrini foresight toward a future communion among peoples. And his vision of a pastoral concern of people without ethnic or geographic boundaries, implying the co-responsibility of the local church. And this is one of the main topics that Pope Francis is stressing with the canonization of Scalabrini. He was a bishop who called the attention of the local church to be co-responsible to care for migrants. And from this perspective, his commitment with the local church in Italy, raising awareness in the United States or in Brazil, where he visited migrant communities, and suggesting to the Holy See to create a structure of pastoral care for global attention of migrants, we can say that Scalabrini vision is a legacy foreseeing the perspective of Fratelli Tutti of Pope Francis. His legacy is, we are a human family. And Pope Francis with Fratelli Tutti is stressing this vision of Scalabrini and Cabrini. And as Sister Barbara said, they were very close friends. And as a good Italians, they have their differences, but in the end of the day, they were collaborating, pushing the agenda together in the same direction. And the fourth aspect is his commitment. He was not a man only with sensitivity and commotion, but he was a very concrete man. His commitment of raising awareness of the social and political arena in the country of origin, in Italy, as I mentioned, with publications, conferences, practical political statements, and other pushing the agenda for directives on migration, and including in countries of destination. When he went to the United States, for example, New York, he visited the local community of migrants, the missionaries, the sisters, the bishop, and then he had in the New York, in the club, Catholic Club of New York, with the entrepreneurs, with the private sector, and he went to Washington, D.C. with President Roosevelt to push the agenda, the political agenda for the recognition of the rights of migrants. So his commitment to raise awareness of the dignity of migrants. And the last topic is his multifaceted and articulated responses.
Father Leonier, I think we may have lost your sound.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Can you hear me?
Oh, okay, great.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. His holistic perspective of pastoral approach in articulating a strategy with different levels of intervention. He founded two congregations, the Congregation of the Missionaries of St. Charles and the Missionary Sisters of St. Charles, and a lay association, the Society of St. Raphael. But in addition, he invited other congregations, the Apostles of the Sacred Heart, the Sisters of St. Anne, the Mother Cabrini's Missionaries of the Sacred Heart. He invited other people to be engaged. And then he suggested Pope Pius IX to establish a pontifical commission globally. So he was personally committed, and he engaged other institutions, other congregations in the church, and civil society actors and political actors. And as part of his legacy, for example, in the Holy See, we have today, in the past, we have the Pontifical Council for Pastoral Care of Migrants and Refugees, and today we have the section of migrants and refugees on the Dicastery of Human Development. In conclusion, Bishop Scalabrini approached migration in a holistic perspective and articulated intervention. And recognizing his legacy, as we know, Pope John Paul II declared himself blessed, and Pope Francis announced that he will be canonized on October 9th. And in the current context of international migration, even though the situations and challenges have changed, Scalabrini and Cabrini remain as a reference and a point of particular methodology of holistic and integral response to the phenomenon of migration. And their legacy is useful for us today. If we apply their motivation, their vision, their commitment, and their methodology of engaging everyone, I think is a good way and inspiration for the engagement today, not only for the Catholic Church, but for all people of goodwill and for international community. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Father Leonier. Now that we've learned a little bit more about both, I wanted to turn back to you, Sister Barbara. Can you tell us a little bit about the work of the missionary sisters of the Sacred Heart and how some of their ministries have worked with migrants, whether here in the US or globally?
Yes, thank you. Look, what we do is strive and take a preferential option for an immigrant population. So when you share that your mother went to Mother Cabrini's school in New York, that would be a preferential option to be able to serve those who aren't able lots of times to access whatever social services and supports they need to become full and functioning citizens in the new societies where they find themselves. So depending on what country we are in, the apostolic work would be culturally appropriate, you know? So in the United States, our two primary works at this point are based in New York City and just a little north of New York City, called Cabrini Immigrant Services, which continues to help people to access legal services, to be able to find healthcare, to find social services that they might be entitled to provide charity care where that's necessary, to help kids get educated, etc. Certainly, one of our works in Uganda, we're up on the border of South Sudan, serving the refugees from the civil war there in the Diocese of Arua, which is a very small geographic area. There's more than 1 million refugees there. And at this point, we're the only congregation that's serving full time. We're waiting for our Scalabrini priests to join us, which is happening soon, we hope, and to work up with that population, which hardly anybody's willing to go to. Even, for example, there are many congregations in Uganda, indigenous congregations, but nobody wants to go up on the border of South Sudan in a dangerous area to work. So we're very proud of being able to be there. In Argentina, we have a school in a peri-urban area called Villa Amelia, and it serves a totally migrant population of students in first, I don't know the new word again, it's just slipping my mind, but indigenous people, native people from Bolivia, Peru, Paraguay, those that are marginated in the society. And in areas where nobody is willing to go, you know, it's always fascinating to me when we want to do repairs to our house, that building is located right on a river, and so it's continually flooded. So whenever we're trying to contract people to serve us, we have to pay twice as much as what we need to pay for repairs, et cetera, that we do in the city of Buenos Aires, because there are no construction companies that are willing to enter into that dangerous area. So we need to go where nobody else is willing to go. We need to serve those who nobody else is willing to serve. Recently, we were evaluating some of our works in Africa, and Cabrini, one of her first loves was education. She was an educator by profession. She loved teaching. And so we have been heavily involved in schools. But when we were setting up the criteria of what schools we want to keep, what schools we maybe are not so charismatically aligned as they were previously, our region, our governmental region of Africa said that they wanted the students who could not pay. And I sat and chuckled when I heard that, because I thought, what other congregation looks for students that can't pay tuition? You know, but those would be the type of legacies. But then there's the ongoing hidden works that go on continuously. Because I think sometimes the issue of forced migration, the image we see are people coming over the border in the boats coming from Africa to Europe, et cetera, and those are tragic. But those are the crises moment. But there's a whole long journey that new people in new cultures need to navigate. So there's that immediate crisis intervention work, but then there's the intermediate and long-term work of helping people to live the fullness of their lives in a new reality. So, you know, some of the things that are pleasing to me, and then were pleasing to me when I was General Superior, are works like, there is a Brazilian woman in the United States who has lived there most of her life, but was never documented. She's now in her 70s. She had to have a leg amputated, and there was no place to care for her. So our long-term healthcare facility in Dobbs Ferry, a nursing home, has her there. And the cost of that is about $500 a day. There's no reimbursement for her. There's no payment for her. And it's a hidden work that we do. A hidden work of an African woman who in New York City who was there because her husband had thrown acid on her face. She went through social service organizations that really helped her with healthcare, et cetera. But then she was at the stage of needing to become much more independent. Okay, so we have some apartment buildings in some very wealthy neighborhoods. Well, we give her an apartment at a very reduced rate. So it's those long-term hidden works that are woven in that are both direct care and structural that helps to continually help the forced migrants and to adapt and to live a fullness of life.
Thank you, Sister Barbara. Father Leonier, can you share a little bit about the Scalabrini areas of ministry that also serve migrants, whether globally or here in the US? I know you already mentioned CMS, but maybe others as well.
Yes, we are working in 34 countries, in 5 continents. When our founders sent our first missionaries, he sent them to New York and Sao Paulo. And he said to them, please go there to build churches, hospitals, schools, and all the structures for the integration of migrants and the dimensions that I mentioned before. Currently, we organize ourselves in what we call the 5 pastoral fields. The pastoral fields are the pastoral positions where we have the missionaries working directly with migrants, refugees, and seafarers. And the 5 pastoral fields are the parishes, providing religious, social, legal services, different services in the parishes. We are present in 180 parishes in 34 countries. Then the second is the centers or shelters of Casa del Migrante, providing food, lodging, legal services, and healthcare and different services, humanitarian support for migrants. The third is the Seafarer Centers ministry. Is not well known, but since the beginning of our congregation, we are still working. The migrants were moving from Italy to Brazil and the United States through the ships. And today, for example, 90% of the goods around the world are moved by ships. And there are more than 1.5 million seafarers. They are permanent migrants. They are going back to their families once a year or every 2 years. And so we are working with them and the children left behind their families with the Seafarer Centers. Is a network of Seafarer Centers. The fourth is the church offices of migrants at the parish level or diocesan level or national level or the global level, for example, here in the Holy See. And the fifth pastoral field are the schools and clinics, these specific services in the field. In addition of these pastoral fields, we have the pastoral, we call pastoral services, our ministries that people, these confreres are not working directly with migrants, but they are working in specific services, providing inputs or support for people in the field. And the 5 pastoral services are research. And here we have the Federation of Center for Migration Studies, conducting research and publishing reports and pushing the agenda some aspects. So research is the first service, not only for the migrants and for the Scalabrinis, it's for society, for the governments. First, it's research. The second is academic training. We have the Scalabrini International Migration Institute here in Rome, and ITESP in Sao Paulo is an institution, academic institution, training new priests on migration and theology and migration issues. Then the third service is communication. There is a network of communication centers with magazines, radio stations, and today with social media, they are pushing the topic of raising awareness with the opinion makers, in addition of decision makers through communication centers. The fourth area is advocacy in fundraising or development promoted by the Scalabrini International Migration Network, CIII. And then there is the Historic Institute promoting the historical perspective and pastoral reflection on pastoral care of migrants. These 5 pastoral fields in pastoral services. And our perspective is similar to what Sister Barbara mentioned. Our perspective is focused on working with, as Pope Francis is stressing this year, is working with migrants, refugees, and seafarers in the short term with humanitarian programs, in the medium term with job placement, job creation, and sustainability for themselves and their families, and in the long term for development and education. As we know, the first right of migrants is the right of development, is the right to stay in their own country. So this is our perspective of work.
Thank you, Father Leonir. Sister Barbara, we know that both of you actually spoke about this, that both Mother Cabrini and Blessed Scalabrini, that they were friends, right? Like that they, partnered with one another. So in your work or the sisters' work in serving migrants, could you tell us a little bit about who you might partner with in the community? That it may not be alone that we're working, but who you're partnering with and how that has helped the community at large.
Yeah, look at the partners are infinite. We are probably the top of the pyramid, which is a very small piece. But there's all kinds of people and collaborators that are foundational to being able to bring about the work that you do. So I think you can tell the Father Leonir and I know each other. We've worked together on different things. We have a mutual affection and respect, and our congregations do. There's a long history between us. And with the sisters, the Scalabrini sisters, we have a joint mission together in Rome for refugee women and their children. And, those are the very obvious ones, but we try not to work in silos and do not work in silos. So we don't stay in a Catholic religious congregational silo. It's very important for us religious congregations to work together. We're all about the same thing, and which is Jesus, is about God, about bringing people and serving our Lord. But there in Swaziland, which I worked there for 10 years, our primary partners were the United States government and the United Nations, WHO, and PEP, the Global Fund, etc. On behalf of the Swaziland was the country with the highest incidence and prevalence of HIV and TB in the world. So those partners, and then the governmental, the Department of Health, the Department of Education, you work with those leaders, you form relationships so that you're all about the same work. It's people of goodwill helping to build the kingdom of God, whether they're conscious of that or not. And the primary partnership is always with our lay collaborators that work in and with us in our organized institutions. So the lay collaborators that formally work for us number about 200 to one sister, so they're vitally important. And as many of them will refer to themselves, they are missionaries of the Sacred Heart. They're not missionary sisters of the Sacred Heart, but I have a Jewish guy who is our chief financial officer for the Institute, and he goes about talking about being a missionary of the Sacred Heart, which, without that type of collaboration and commitment to vision and mission, none of this would be possible. So it's all of us working together. And I found it very interesting, Father Leonir, when you talked about Monsignor Scalabrini understanding that migration was providential in creating more of a world vision, us being brothers and sisters in the world. And I suspect that that's what our life is about, because we pray all the time in the Our Father that God's kingdom come as in heaven, as it is on earth, as it is in heaven. And that's what we're about doing, is trying to build kingdom and reign of God here in the here and now, as well as worrying about afterlife. But let us worry about the here and now, because that's what we have real control over.
Thank you, Sister Barbara. Leonard, I know you mentioned a little bit earlier about when you were talking about Blessed Scalabrini, about even in his day, right, about reaching out to lots of folks, right, whether it be governmental or non-governmental. Can you talk a little bit about who are some of the current partners of the Scalabrinis, especially in your work with migrants?
Yes, is in our DNA as Scalabrinians, working with migrants, engaging ourselves with them, but engaging with the local church and all the actors of the local church and the civil society organizations and government institutions at the local level, national level, and international level. A few examples. With the local church, as Sister Barbara mentioned, that since the beginning we were collaborating, even if it's not in a strategic and global perspective, but there is collaboration in different countries. The last example, in Addis Ababa, 2 years ago, we started a program with 12 congregations working together and replicating a model that we started 25 years ago in Latin America, working in the Conference of Catholic Bishops. And it was the collaboration between the countries of the church, the local church, of countries of origin, transit, destination, and return, Latin America, at the Conference of Catholic Bishops. But there was a collaboration between different congregations. For example, there are migrants with healthcare problems. We have the Chameleon Fathers. We have migrants with, they are in jail. We have other congregations working with them. We have people, so in Addis Ababa, there are 12 congregations working with the sisters of charity, the Salesian sisters, the Cabrini sisters, the Salesian Fathers, all working together as a church with the Archdiocese of Addis Ababa, and then engage in the private sector, the civil society, to push in the agenda the development and integration of migrants, and push in the agenda the government. There are good examples in Latin America of changing the way of providing the visa for migrants through job placement and job creation. Chile, and Brazil, and in other countries, and Mexico in certain areas. So, and in the international level, the same. With the UN, we have a representation offices in New York and Geneva, trying to push in the agenda the aspects currently, the two global compacts on migrants and refugees, and ILO, UNICEF, all the different bodies of the United Nations pushing the agenda for the recognition of dignity and rights of migrants. So in few words, as part of our DNA, we are still following the steps of Scalabrini, work with migrants and work with people who can make a difference in migrants' life with the local church, with the society, and the politicians, with the political actors.
Thank you, Father Leonir. I have one more question for you both, and then we'll open it up to other questions from the audience. So those online, if you want to go ahead and start submitting those through the chat box, and then those who are there in the room, there's a CMS representative in there who will make sure that funnels the questions to us. So Sister Barbara, as we are celebrating this Jubilee year of Mother Cabrini, and wanting to have a way to celebrate, do you have any suggestions for those that are listening in today for what they might be able to do, whether in their communities or more broadly, nationally, globally, to continue the legacy of Mother Cabrini in their day-to-day life?
Yeah, I think the primary way of continuing the legacy of Mother Cabrini is to love your neighbor, to love the people that are in front of you, to be kind and to be charitable. Specifically, when I say we take a preferential option for migrants, there's all levels of work that people can do, whether it be in the local parish. You know, in the United States, the face of the Catholic Church is changing. It's becoming a huge population of Hispanics. I think it's about 1/3 at this point. Can the Anglo and the Hispanics work together, work as brothers and sisters? Can we provide welcoming communities and service to one another? There's also a whole level of structure that all of us are able to impact, no matter what country we're in, for the most part. But in those societies where we have the capacity to vote and to influence policy and procedure, we can actively participate in that and advocate on behalf of migrants who are forced to flee, and to remember our own heritage. Those of us who come from the Americas, all of us come from an immigrant background, and how easy it is for us to forget that, and how easy it is to forget what our parents or our grandparents or our great-grandparents had to suffer and endure to be able to establish the lives that are now established here. So we need to help the narrative and look at the positive dimensions of what migration does for society. There has been movement of peoples always. You know, when I was in Rome, I was always stood in awe of the history of people traveling from the Middle East and from Egypt and Malta and Greece and all those areas that has been going on for millennia. And so we just need to recognize each other as brother and sister, but we also need to be proactive, changing a narrative, making a positive narrative about what migration does, and standing against injustices that are not only impact us very immediately, but that we know are impacting people that may live in a different country, but we can have an impact and a voice in those things.
Thank you, Sister Barbara. Father Leonier, what about from your end as we get ready to celebrate the canonization next month? What are ways that those who are listening in today might continue the legacy of what will soon be our new saint?
Yes. From the faith perspective, and the similar way that Sister Barbara mentioned, what moved Bishop Scalabrini and Mother Cabrini was the conviction of in each face of us, Jesus is present. We are image of God. So, and recognizing this perspective, they were very committed to, convinced of that, they acted in accordance with this conviction. Their faith was a faith on not only of sensitivity, or they, as Pope Francis used to say, they acted with the three main aspects in their brain and their heart and their hands. Their vision, their commitment, and their action, concrete action as a church. And the second aspect is engaging other people in this perspective, because if we work alone, it's sometimes it's impossible. Today migration is one of the main challenges of society, and changing the narrative, engaging other people, especially opinion makers, decision makers, it's very important. And then the confidence that Fratelli Tutti is the goal, is the north of our societies. Even if there are today, there are some groups trying to sell fear, or that the war are more important or more powerful than the love, as Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis are stressing. Love, the love of God for us is powerful, is more powerful than the guns. And especially the guns try to stop migrants. The walls, not only the physical walls, the legal walls, the cultural walls, the faith walls. And their legacy is inviting us to have this open mind, open heart, and open hands.
Thank you, Father Leonier. So now we'll open it up to folks for them to submit questions for either one of our panelists today. The first one is for you, Father Leonier. So this morning at the conference during the Tomasi lecture, Father spoke about the crisis of loss of migrant life at sea. So this person is wondering how the Scalabrini Network is following in the footsteps of Scalabrini's work with seafarers in addressing this contemporary crisis.
Yes, as I mentioned before, we are present in the main ports of Latin America, especially, and then in Asia and Africa, and here in Europe, we don't have a big presence. But especially during the pandemic crisis, we realized that how these people can be totally abandoned by the media, by the society sometimes, or by the people protecting their rights, and especially the problems, psychological problems that they have, the loneliness, to be far from their families. And so we are trying to respond with this network of seafarer centers, providing information for them, connection with their families, promoting Know Your Right programs, Know Your Rights, and protecting their rights, and to be in touch with the companies of seafarer companies, in order to support their needs and their. And this is a big challenge. And we are working with other different organizations, the Stella Maris network, with other organizations, and again, the similar way with working with migrants, the strategy is similar with the local church, with other church organizations, civil society organizations, for example, the ITF, the International Transportation Organization, and the governments, different governments, ILO, at the international level. We try to work with the church, civil society, and governments, pushing the agenda, the topic of recognition and protection of seafarers and their families.
Thank you, Father Leonier. Sister Barbara, the next question is for you. Earlier, you spoke about Mother Cabrini, how she ministered not only to Italians, but all those in the community. Right now, with recent arrivals from Afghanistan or the Ukraine, that other groups of migrants may be left behind, those that are crossing through the border, etc. So what advice might you have for getting communities to think about serving all instead of maybe just one particular group of migrants over another?
Yeah, that's very challenging. You know, first of all of us have a limited scope of influence. And so I would really encourage people to use their influence in that scope of influence that they have. And there's something very natural. Cabrini naturally served Italians because that's the group that she knew and understood. So there's nothing wrong with kind of ethnocentric responses, in the sense that sometimes that's the most effective way. But we just need to keep remembering who God is, and that God has no preferential option for any people, any culture, and that we need to encourage each other. For example, even this discussion with Father Leonier and myself, we cannot do what the missionary sisters cannot do what the Scalabrini priests are doing. And the Scalabrini priests cannot do what we are doing. But we are a picture of a mosaic that gives a full response. And I think one of the other things that, especially since we're in the United States, this conference is primarily aimed at that audience. When you're asking how to continue a legacy, you know, one of the things that we, the missionary sisters, have decided to do is to change our investment policies, and not just policies, but actions for impact. So we invest in small businesses that are run by immigrants, run by women, run by minority groups. We invest in a company that helps set bond for immigrants who are undocumented, that are held in holding places, and they have to set bond. We give them the money for the bond that gets repaid. So we're changing our whole investment policy, which is a high-level structure, but it gives us a footprint and a response in a way that we are no longer capable of doing physically because of limited numbers of sisters. But there are creative ways of impacting and continuing the mission. And anybody listening and participating in this has some means and mechanisms that may require some creative thinking, but there are ways of responding to the church. And I think that that's what we need to remember, whether they're Afghans, whether they're Mexicans, whether they're Nigerians, whether they're Vietnamese, we're all part of the church. We are all people of God.
Thank you, Sister Barbara. So we're going to pause for a moment so that there can be a live announcement in the room. So Jacqueline, if you want to go ahead and make that announcement so that we can see if there are any questions in the room, and then we can continue after that.
If anybody in the live audience has any questions, please feel free to just say your question up here, and I'll make sure it's communicated to the moderators.
I had a quick question about the that goes to the legacy of Mother Cabrini and Bishop Scalabrini, and I guess it's a two-part question. The first part of it speaks to the church's mission to the world, and you know, I'm thinking of the Holy Father's words that the church's mission isn't a religious ideology so much as it's a mission of good Samaritanism. And the idea is to overcome narrowness and conflict and tribalism, and to promote reconciliation and fraternity and sharing and justice. And the second part of the legacy, it seems to me, has more pastoral implications. And I feel like these are maybe the teaching from this came from these two saints. And it's what the US bishops called a kind of nativism that emerges in institutions in the church when established members insist that there's just one way to worship, one set of hymns, one small handful of familiar devotions, one way to organize a parish community, one language, and that all immigrants have to adapt to that way of doing things. And they go on to say that that newcomers can't be seen as passive recipients of the church's mission. That the idea is that you basically have to meet them where they are. And it seems to me that those two lessons or those two teachings resonate very much with the legacies of these two saints. That's a question, I guess.
Sister Barbara, Father Lanier?
Yeah, my response is I actually think that your question was kind of answered by yourself, but thank you. Look, at the whole question is that we all need to lean into this stuff. There is no easy solution. We're all impacted by culture. Right? We all get positively or negatively impacted. So the polarization, the one way of doing things, the nativism, we all fall prey to it, and we are all called to transcend it. And that is an ongoing daily work that demands personal reflection, personal self-knowledge, and personal courage to encourage others to look at how they contribute to the sinfulness of any particular culture, but then to also look at the holiness of any particular culture. So it's a daily living into the mystery that we're called to live into, I think.
Father Leonier, is there anything you wanted to add?
Maybe going back to the statement of Sister Barbara, she mentioned before, what is the God's perspective of this phenomenon? This is the perspective of Scalabrini to interpret this phenomenon, migration, the people moving from one country to another, not only as a social phenomenon, but from theological perspective. Pope Francis is stressing all the time the need of discernment, the discernment. What is God's plan? What is the God's vision of this issue? So if we start from our perspective, we will go to our ideology, as was mentioned, or by our own national identity, and sometimes these are going back to the conflicts. And Pope Francis used to say the only place there is no conflict is the cemetery. Everybody is very calm there. And when we have societies, alive societies, we have conflicts. We have differences of interpretation. And we have a different, and we are free to interpret and to have our own vision. But as a church, we are invited for the discernment, what is God's will? What is God's vision? And this requires a more theological interpretation, and to come together and to discern together and to try to build communion in diversity. So this is a very, very, very important question that we can answer together through discernment. How can we go beyond ideology, nativism, conflicts? If we try to push our own vision, the tension will stop in the conflict, as Pope Francis used to say. The tensions are natural, but it's important to go beyond that. The tensions not stop in the conflict. In my own vision, in your own vision, in our different visions, and we'll stay in our own, protecting our flags or our own vision. We are invited to go beyond the conflicts and the tensions and to build communion in diversity. And this is possible when we have a recognition of a common God, that we are their children.
Thank you, Father Leonier. There's probably time for about one more question. So I don't know if there are any more in the room. I think there's someone walking up to the mic.
This is Monsignor Vitillo, and I don't have so much a question, but maybe some observations, and I want to greet two wonderful friends. Sister Barbara, I met first in Swaziland, and was very much impressed by the wonderful work you did there, and you did it with your religious, but also with so many lay people. And I saw them have the spirit of Madre Cabrini as they did the work. And then of course, Father Leonier, whom I see much more often, and I feel like I've been in many ways formed by the Scalabrinis and by Madre Cabrini from my Italian roots. But there are two things that struck me. One is that both of you talked about the role of lay people within your congregation congregations. And I think that's really important because so many times people have the impression that it's only the clergy or only the religious women and men who are doing this work and have the visions. And for our own organization, the International Catholic Migration Commission, the real spirit behind this was a layman, an American layman, James Norris, who befriended Pope Pius XII and at that time Archbishop Montini, and convinced them that we needed to have a network of Catholic Church responses to migration. And that's how the International Catholic Migration Commission was founded. And James Norris was the first layperson to address the Ecumenical Council. And he chose the theme of poverty, and he gave an excellent address in Latin. And that was the source of probably the beginning of the development of the encyclical Populorum Progressio. So I think it's really important for us to recognize the role of the lay people in all that we do. And I guess just one other point that I wanted to make was that I think you both talked about the pastoral work and the education and the health and the advocacy, but I think also we need to see the need to much more to focus on labor and on work for migrants and refugees. In too many countries, they're not allowed to work. And also the fact that, as Pope Francis says, so many times through work, we'll get to development. So thank you both for a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much
Bob.
for those opportunities.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So we have run out of time. So I want to take this opportunity to thank both of our speakers today, Sister Barbara and Father Leonier, for being with us, for giving us a little bit more of the lives of both Mother Cabrini and Bishop Scalabrini. We look forward to next month and the new canonization. And we want to thank CMS for hosting this conference and giving this opportunity of encounter. So thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I'm so loud all the time that I usually don't need a mic. So hi, good afternoon again. Welcome back, everyone. My name is Margene Perhat. I'm the Vice President at Catholic Charities Archdiocese of Boston's Refugee and Immigrant Services Division. Long title. Unfortunately, the zeros at my salary don't match that very long titles, many zeros, but really blessed to have been able to work in the Catholic network now for about 25 years. So, so thank you all for being here. And I just want to say a huge thanks to Don for the opportunity to having this conference, and to your amazing team who've been working so hard behind the scenes to keep everything moving along. I don't know about me, but I don't know about you guys, but for me, just having these past 2 days to listen and to learn from all the various speakers and to really feel a sense of rejuvenation. And, you know, this work that we all do, I think we can agree that it's difficult. It's rewarding, of course, but that it's hard on many, many levels. And so, you know, I just found this opportunity to be among friends, I like to say, and speaking languages of love and care for the refugees and immigrants we serve, which sometimes in our regular lives, we don't have the chance to do that. You know, I just really appreciate the opportunity for conferences like this to get that rejuvenation, and really excited to continue on this work with all of you. So for today's final plenary topic, restoring and rebuilding U.S. refugee and legal immigration systems to welcome migrants, I'm really excited to feature a panel of experts in the resettlement and immigration legal worlds. And we'll have some concrete examples of how each of their respective agencies are rebounding, rebuilding, and reframing the work that we do to serve. I will encourage you to read the full bios of each of these esteemed folks in your packets, but I'd like to give some brief introductions now. So Barb Graham is an immigration attorney and program director at Catholic Charities Archdiocese of Milwaukee, and she's going to share local perspective of how her program was already having to respond to a myriad of changes in administrative and federal policies in the last 5 years. And if that was not difficult enough, we had the COVID pandemic and the challenges that it brought in terms of service delivery. So Barb's going to demonstrate how her agency was able to adapt and meet these new realities. And through the use of some really creative technology, which might be a resource that we often forget about in our day-to-day activities. And then we'll be joined by Bill Canny, who's joining us from Washington, D.C., where he is the Executive Director of Migration and Refugee Services at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And Bill's going to share his experiences of leading what I believe to be one of the best, the Catholic Resettlement Network, through a period that saw the near decimation of the U.S. refugee program by the prior administration, and then having to rebuild that same network to respond about a year ago this time to the evacuation of Afghans after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so Bill's going to speak to us about how he was able to engage many sectors of the church to support that massive effort, which is still continuing on today. And then Anna Gallagher, the Executive Director of Catholic Legal Immigration Services, Inc. Clinic, who leads the largest network of charitable immigration legal service programs, will help us round out our discussion by explaining how Clinic has repeatedly had to rebuild as it is called upon to respond to the legal needs of people seeking asylum at the border, defending vulnerable populations, and all while helping to support an ever-growing network of critically needed immigration legal service providers. So Anna's going to help us reflect on how crises can be opportunities for us to look for broad responses to the needs of all migrants, regardless of how the migrants come, if they're coming as evacuees from a humanitarian crisis that is all over the newspaper, or as they're coming across our borders and ending up in our interior locations in the country. So we hope for our panel to be casual and informal, so don't be surprised if one of us has a question for another, but we will have ample time for Q&A at the end. But so for now, I'm going to turn it over to Barb.
Thank you. So one of my lifelong bad habits is I talk too fast. I think I'm speaking so slowly that people are going to zone out. But if I start like taking off, just like tell me to slow down. I want to start and tell you a little bit about what we tried to do to reach out to people. One of the chronic and pretty valid criticisms of our program is that we never did a great job getting out to the smaller areas of the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. It takes me an hour to get up to Fond du Lac and Sheboygan. It takes me an hour to get down to Kenosha. And like a lot of people, and I think it's true of a lot of dioceses, they think that we're city-centric, that we're centered in Milwaukee, and the people in the hinterland, good luck, go fend for yourself. But when there was a great opportunity a long time ago called 245I, which would mean nothing to you, just take my word for it. There's this great thing called 245I, and we wanted to get it out to people. So in a moment of abject madness, I scheduled 36 days in a row of presentations. And we did them morning, noon, and night, and we hit the Archdiocese, and we got 2,100 people in 36 days. Which was great, but I was also statutorily stupid at the end of 36 days. Like I just hadn't had a day off in 36 days and you're kind of numb at the end of it. But there were a number of things that came out of that taught us a lesson. And one was that the immigrant community has a really strong rumor mill that has immense credibility. And because they have so much, there's such a lack of legal services and opportunity to access legal services, they end up getting their legal services from like their hairdresser and their mechanic and somebody they can access. It's their cousin's friend's cousin-in-law, whatever, but they don't get it from people who are giving them good and accurate information. So they end up getting these rumors. We also found that when we stuck around at the end of these presentations, we ended up answering a lot of the same questions over and over and over again. How do you get a passport? What are the waivers for citizenship? But also people would stand up and say things in public that I didn't want them to have to say. Like they would say, my daughter's a rape victim, can she get a green card out of it? Knowing there's this thing called non-immigrant status, but I don't want people to have to admit in public that about their family, or saying that my husband's in prison because he got convicted for doing a drug deal, my husband beats me. So we're trying to figure out a way to get information out to people so that we wouldn't have to, people wouldn't have to be able to come to a live presentation. And also kind of dawned on me that we were never going to meet the need. It doesn't matter how much money Catholic Charities throws at me. We have 5 staff attorneys right now, and we still can't keep up with what we need to do. So that and that working 36 days in a row, not a sustainable work model. So what we tried to do was look for ways we could address those needs that A, were affordable. I have a chief operating officer who would like me to pay attention to my budget, and a way that we could actually get out to people that was kind of something we could do that was convenient. I love photography. I took my Canon 5D Mark IV and we did our first video, which is a bilingual Spanish-English video on the Violence Against Women Act. Can you get the sound on it, maybe? Okay, forget it then, no sound. Take my word for it, it's in Spanish and English. And this is Gabby Parra, who is one of our staff attorneys, and she does a whole thing on VAWA and what you need to get the Violence Against Women Act, which is a gender-neutral statute to protect domestic violence victims whose family members should apply for them, but because of the domestic violence, they don't. And it's meant to explain to them it's emotional, it's physical. A lot of our clients have no idea they're domestic violence victims because they think it's just their lot in life. They think it's just what it is. But we wanted people to be able, in the peace and privacy of their own home, to access this kind of information without the abuser knowing they were even looking for it. They could look on their kid's tablet, they could look on their smartphone. So what we first started doing was we did a website, which one of the local women's religious orders who had run one of the hospitals gave us. And we have a bilingual website so you can look up all kinds of information on family-based immigration, on how to get citizenship, on we do the religious visas for the archdiocese. So we have a whole section on if you're a priest, this is how you first get this R1, and this is how you morph it into a special immigrant religious worker. So people could read it, because a lot of people learn better by reading than they do by We also have a thing on detained immigrants, and if you're a detained immigrant, where do you go pay the bond? Where do you pay the bond in Wisconsin? What are the bonding companies in Wisconsin? How does bonding work? What are the risks of paying a bond? We had all kinds of information on there. And it ended up being such a great thing for us that we moved along and did a YouTube channel. And the YouTube channel for us was a way to get not only legal information, but they kind of broadened out into the refugee concerns as well. So one of the things we did was somebody sent a text to every single Congolese in one of the congregations telling them not to get a COVID vaccine because it was the US government's plan to take out the African community. So one of our Congolese workers got his COVID vaccine on YouTube and he filmed himself. And at the end, he's like, hey, I'm not dead yet, I'm still here. And then he filmed himself getting his vaccination booster shot and he still was not dead. But we were able to do things like that. We were able to do things like how to rent an apartment, how to fill out a job application, that were more, it's not just an immigration law thing. It's more of a general, for the general immigrant community. We were able to do, I'm trying to find some of the other things that we did, but we did the differences between VAWA and U for people who don't know the difference between VAWA and U for domestic violence victims. We could do a thing on the citizenship waivers and how to get citizenship. We actually did every single citizenship question so people could just listen to it on a loop over and over and over again. So you can listen to it in your car and you can listen to, so even if your English isn't great, for those, I don't know how many of you do citizenship, but your English doesn't have to be great. You don't have to have Shakespeare, but you do have to be able to say, I support the Constitution of the United States. So we had all that kind of stuff. So people could just listen to it over and over again, then a section on how to write, and you could write Abraham Lincoln and make sure that you could spell it right. And this was free, like YouTube, it didn't cost us anything to set up a YouTube channel. And initially it didn't cost us anything to set up the website. And the last thing we did, we decided we had gotten a grant to do citizenship as a pro bono bar. And for those of you who do much this kind of work, it's really hard to get a pro bono bar for immigration because the cases take forever. I mean, I have a client now, it was 1999, he got put into deportation and his adjustment of status is still pending. And I might retire one of these days before he actually gets his green card. But we decided we were going to do one for citizenship. And in the middle of that, Afghanistan imploded and we were not going to do that. We decided instead we were going to try to do a pro bono bar for the asylum, this Afghans who needed asylum. So we got the same funder, funded us to do this, and we were able to do a series of traditional CLE materials, the video presentations and traditional PowerPoints. And it's kind of interesting to me, like the people my age and a little younger are the traditional CLE generation. And then there's the people a little bit younger than that, and they are the PowerPoint generation. And for the kids, we end up doing TikToks. So we've got a series of videos on like, literally, we've got an entire thing on, you want to talk about a boring video to watch. We've got an entire thing on the bars to asylum. So we've got a video on the bars to asylum. We've got a PowerPoint on the bars to asylum, and we've got the written materials on the bars to asylum. We set them up on a shared Google network. So anybody who promised to take a case could get the materials. And we wanted this so that we could remove all the bars between a pro bono program and people taking the cases. So you can watch this on the beach in Fort Lauderdale on vacation. You can watch this in your jammies on a Saturday morning drinking coffee. If you've got a firm that's lucky enough to promote pro bono, you can watch it at work. The State Bar of Wisconsin helped us to promote, and they will provide malpractice for everyone who doesn't have malpractice on their own. Catholic Charities Milwaukee, Green Bay, Madison, Charities La Crosse, Green Bay, Milwaukee, as well as a group in Madison, all got together and created the materials and helped to recruit pro bono attorneys. So now we have 161 attorneys in the state of Wisconsin who are taking pro bono claims. And everybody who needs a pro bono lawyer can get a free lawyer in the state of Wisconsin. We've got 107 them out. So for us, that was time, but the Google Drive's free. And it was people who already knew each other and respected and liked each other. We're all Catholic Charities who've been knowing each other since the cooling of the earth. And we've been able to put together these kinds of materials and be available for people. We set up a Google phone number for being able to call and ask numbers. So let me see if I can get on this. We've got the YouTube, but this is just what we did in the basement where we work, buying a camera. We have one guy who is now doing nothing but our social media. But apart from that one staff position, which is not nothing, we were able to do all of this without spending a ton of money. But that's kind of been what we've tried to do, to dispel the rumor. For us, it's been great because I can open my laptop and I can say DACA's on, DACA's off, DACA's back on. You can apply for the first time, you can't renew, and get all that information out literally in 20 minutes. I can't reach the entire Archdiocese of Milwaukee in 20 minutes, but I can open my laptop and for no money, I can upload a YouTube channel, a YouTube video, and get to people all over the country. The only downside of this, if anybody decides you want to try this, I will warn you, when we started our TikTok channel, 40% of our traffic came from inside of Afghanistan because it was people trying to figure out how to get out of Afghanistan. And we had a lot of phone calls from people who are like in New York or in Afghanistan or in Ukraine right now. I can't take clients from Ukraine. I can barely take clients from Milwaukee, but it does generate more traffic than we will ever be able to help. But one thing we've done on our website is we did provide links to like the Catholic Legal Immigration Network. And here's the list of affiliates. And here's the good attorneys in Wisconsin that I know. And I think that's my 15 minutes. Oh, it's my 5 minutes. So it's great because we could put, the lawyers are lawyers. Some of us, maybe shouldn't be doing immigration. I think my personal bias is unless you only do immigration, you shouldn't do it at all. Like unless you're going to do a little bit of like house closing and a little bit of divorce and a little bit of this, it's really hard to keep up with it. But we have a list of attorneys who know are good. We could do links to the sources we know are good. The Catholic Legal Immigration Network, if you live in Raleigh, you can get on their website and here's who's in Raleigh and does immigration work. But thank you. That's kind of been our response. And it was also nice for us because it gave us sort of a creative outlet as a staff. Margie was saying that this can be kind of heavy work and it can be a lot after a while, but this was something creative for us to get together and do it as a staff that we really enjoyed. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barbara. It's just so, I think sometimes we get scared of technology, those of us in nonprofit, and to see you really embrace it and use it as a way to so expand your reach is just incredible. So thank you, and definitely be checking out your videos. And now I'm really happy to turn it over to Bill Canny, who is going to talk to us about some national responses and how USCCB has really stepped up to the challenge of resettlement and all the crises that we're called to manage. So turning it over to Bill.
You can hear me okay? Great. Well, first of all, I want to thank Don Kerwin, who I see sitting in the front row, for continuing to knock on the door of immigrant integration. Don has been critical in our church in this country, trying to pull Catholic organizations together to help immigrants not just seek asylum, not just seek refugee status, et cetera, but to integrate. And Don, your efforts are greatly, greatly appreciated. I also just want to point out, even before I move forward, that a number of people in the audience and on the panel helped out tremendously with the Afghan welcome in this country. Barb and her colleagues at all the Catholic charities in Wisconsin who have a very nice tradition of meeting together frequently, discussing programs, etc. Particularly, of course, the Catholic Charities of La Crosse, but all of them helped out in the fort in Wisconsin. A couple people in El Paso in the audience from the Diocesan Migration and Refugee Services. Leadership there key to our response at the base in El Paso. Kevin Appleby stepped up, some of the sisters. So I just wanted to point the good people out that are there already listening. As you know, President Biden in April said we were going to end our intervention in Afghanistan. People weren't sure if he was serious, but on July 8th, he said, we're going to be out by September. That led to a bit of a gallop on the part of one, contractors who left Afghanistan, two, Afghan troops who, without contractors and support, got skittish. The president eventually left. And also the US government began to think about evacuating SIVs, special immigrant visa folks, people who had helped the military in their mission in Afghanistan, whether directly in the military, with other organizations, with intelligence services, etc. That program, that SIV program, was set up in 2009. I mentioned July 8th. By July 14th, we got a call from the State Department and Department of Defense asking the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and the International Rescue Committee to join a diverse group of government organizations at Fort Lee, Virginia, to welcome some 2,500 SIVs who they knew, who were on lists, who were designated, and who were ready to come to the United States. We said yes, and 3 days later, we were all meeting at Fort Lee and setting up a program to welcome these Afghans. Our role at USCCB was to provide some legal orientation and some MWR activities. MWR meaning morale, welcome, and recreation. This is an acronym used on all the military bases across the country to basically provide recreation activities for families on the bases. As plane loads arrived that week, we began our programming. I also began calling Catholic Charities of the Commonwealth of Virginia, Catholic Charities of Arlington, begging for short-term staff and volunteers. I called Anna Gallagher at Clinic for technical help, sent word to the broader Catholic Charities Network, same message, help. Catholic Relief Services, help. Justice for Immigrants Coalition, help. Religious orders and congregations, help. All responded, Bill, how can we help? How much help do you need? In a few weeks, we were looking at shutting this short-term mission accomplished, so to speak. However, as you know, the chaos in Kabul ensued and the emergency evacuation started. The decision to shut down quickly reversed contingency plans for new bases, some 7 or 8 across the country. The state awarded us and IRC a request to do the same programs. Do I say yes or no? Certainly, we weren't well prepared at USCCB to do an emergency program domestically of that scope and size. But as many of you would have done, I certainly said yes. 3 bases in Virginia were set up, 1 in New Mexico, Wisconsin, New Jersey, Indiana, and Texas. Another safe haven was set up at the Hyatt Hotel in Bethesda for medical cases. Now I am really making phone calls, sending out texts, emails to relevant dioceses, nearby Catholic charities, Jesuit refugee services, again, CRS, clinic, legal clinics in all these places, parishes, the Lutherans of the Rocky Mountains, etc. You know, sometimes I've seen a church philosophy, particularly when I worked perhaps in Geneva and would go to Rome, where people would say, you know, we've been around for 2,000 years, Bill. We're not going any place. What's our hurry? Well, take a contract with the State Department and Department of Defense, and if you take that attitude, and that work will be given to someone else really fast. We had a number of challenges setting up on those bases. 40% of the evacuees were kids. Most of them, the vast majority, were not SIVs. They were taxi drivers. They were agricultural workers. They were laborers. They were not particularly well educated in Kabul. We had no staff, as I mentioned, no national supply chain, no centralized purchase capacity, and certainly some accounting challenges as we were moving forward. Now, as I mentioned, we had a few areas of concern, but as we move forward, again, everyone responded, particularly the organizations that I mentioned. We had a successful project. Some 75,000 Afghans went through those bases, and we're just finishing up at the National Convention Center these days in Leesburg, Virginia. A final plane load arrived this week, and approximately 80,000 Afghans will have come through this Operation Allies Welcome. You haven't heard much about it, frankly, because all of us working on the bases have essentially been under a gag order or an agreement with the Department of Defense not to talk about it. We will be talking about it a bit more in the future. At the same time that we were welcoming these Afghans, the Catholic Charities Network across the country and the other 8 resettlement agencies were resettling these Afghans. They were gearing up. They were hiring staff. They were trying, as mentioned earlier, to overcome the Trump administration's effective evisceration of the resettlement network. By the end of 9 months later, a few months ago, the Catholic Network had resettled 13,000 of the Afghans, the most of any resettlement agency in the country, and reestablished, frankly, the church in the US as the largest resettlement network in the world. This has been done, of course, with volunteers, parishes, etc. And I'll go back and mention volunteers. The Catholic Charities of La Crosse in Wisconsin itself had 700 volunteers at the base at Fort McCoy, 700 themselves, incredible, along with, of course, the other charities in the state, as I mentioned. This has been a super effort. I've been particularly moved by it. I've worked with the church for 40 years and was incredibly moved by this effort. I've never been more proud. Everyone said yes in any way, shape, or form that they could help. And let me not fail to mention the International Catholic Migration Commission also. You know, we don't often get the opportunities, as Don knows, as he's tried to corral us around integration of migrants, we don't often get the opportunities to work together. And this was a very, very unique opportunity. And we did a tremendous job as a church in this country, a tremendous job working together, pulling together. We took the call to action and took the call to love. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill. It's definitely something to be so proud of. And now I'd like to turn it over to Anna. And so we can talk about maybe how we can replicate some of that great work that's already been done.
Thank you, Marjane. And before I start, I just want to thank Don for putting together this amazing conference and inviting me to speak here. I also want to thank Melissa, who I'm sure is running around, and Jacqueline, and then the folks behind the scenes for all that you've done to make this a welcoming, warm, and engaging conference. So thank you. Also, just to thank my panelists, I'm always moved by your words. And I have to say, I'm deeply, deeply moved by the Catholic response to the Afghan situation. And Clinic has been proud to join USCCB and our partners in responding to that. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to tell you a little bit about who we are, who CIII is, what we do, how our affiliates have been able to pivot and respond in creative ways during one of the most difficult times in CIII's history, a time of challenges, change, and great opportunities during COVID. I'm also going to talk a little bit about our Afghan and border work, the need for increased legal services capacity, and finally, I'm going to end a little bit with our faith. So CIII is an organization that was started in 1988 under the leadership and vision of Bishop DiMarzio. And it started with a few offices. And I think Bishop DiMarzio tells a story that one of the offices was in El Paso in a garage. So we started out humble. And look at us now. We are 450 affiliates across the country in 49 states and the District of Columbia. CIII has grown to 450 affiliates. We have 2,300 accredited reps and thousands of other staff members who work in our affiliates in our network. Initially, it was primarily Catholic organizations, and now we have, I think there's a majority of non-Catholic, secular, and other faith-based organizations that have joined CIII. So we are a powerhouse. I like to describe us as the largest poor people's immigration law firm in the country. And that's what we are. That's what our network is. The largest the poor people's immigration law firm in the country. So just moving a little bit to, how we come together to restore and rebuild after particular damage during the last administration and in action. I have to say, it's been a model, the Afghan, responding to the Afghan crisis, because we've come together with USCCB, with all our Catholic charities, with other organizations to respond to that. And that's actually been a model when we think about future responses that are emergency for us to follow. So in the absence of immigration reform, which is unlikely, we work to advocate for administrative policies to improve the lives of immigrants, to restore, to rebuild a bit, right? Because I think the dream of advocates and advocacy at the federal level in Washington, D.C. is to push for full immigration legal reform. That's unlikely. So we do what we can, when we can, and how we can. So CIII is very involved in TPS, temporary protected status, in advocating for temporary protected status of certain populations. So we work hard to promote TPS for countries facing emergency or desperate situations that prevent them from living safely in their home countries. Millions and millions of people rely on TPS. It's part of our laws that people fleeing certain conditions can come to the United States, can live in the United States, obtain temporary protection and a work permit. And it's hard as heck, folks, sometimes to get it. This year, we're particularly proud after a campaign of advocacy in which we sought to center and uplift the voices of the directly impacted people and Black-led organizations. TPS for Cameroon was finally granted, which was necessary given the ongoing civil war and the conditions in that country. So we're proud of the administrative work we do and sort of the quiet behind the scenes work we do to change, to restore, to rebuild. So moving a little bit to our affiliates, I have to say I'm really proud to lead this organization with 400 affiliates, and I'm particularly proud of how our affiliates responded to COVID. I mean, who could have imagined in early 2020 that within 3 months the whole country would be shut down? That all our procedures, our processes, the ways we did work would change dramatically. And our affiliates were able to pivot and embrace technology, TikTok, YouTube. And so our affiliates were able to pivot, embrace technology. We reimagined the immigration court processes because we moved to virtual immigration court hearings. And that in some ways expands the access to legal counsel, because you can have attorneys across the country representing individuals. So that's been a positive. Again, a crisis that turns into an opportunity. consultations, the ability to do legal consultations, and identify more volunteers to do legal consultations by video. For example, we have a project at the border I'll speak about a little bit in a few minutes. All of the clients, most of the folks at the border who we were serving had cell phones, so had access to speak with attorneys or legal representatives in the United States. Well, obviously to speak to their families as well, but to gain information through consultations by phone virtually. So that's just some examples of what our affiliates did. We reimagined the court proceedings, virtual conversations, know your rights, and helping border asylum seekers to prepare their applications. So talking a little bit about our border response, in 2018, late 2018, you'll all remember the horrible images on the television of women and children being tear gassed in Tijuana, and then the border ultimately shut down. So thousands and thousands of asylum seekers were caught all along the southern border. Clinic and its affiliates operate inside the United States. NGOs, US-based NGOs were afraid and concerned about sending personnel or staff to Mexico to serve the population there. We made the decision after discernment and consultation with our colleagues along the border, Hope Border Institute, DMRS, Bishop Seitz, our board member who is in El Paso. We took the decision to open a project in El Paso, the Estamos Unidos project, and sent an attorney there. The attorney there was in charge of starting up a project, working with organizations in El Paso and in Ciudad Juarez to provide know your rights presentations, consultations, to work directly with applicants for asylum there to determine if they're eligible, to help them start to fill out applications. We organized volunteers from our affiliates, volunteers from Catholic Charities across the country who went and spent a week at a time to work with the asylum seekers along the border. We maintained that project. Clinic continued the work on that project for 2 years until we were able to identify another organization to assist and to continue the work. Because Clinic, while we are a back office, we provide technical assistance, support, training, etc. And we go into direct representation and provide direct services where needed. In this case, it was successful. We were able to accompany and support the community there, and we were able to assist thousands of people in advising of their rights and preparing them for their entry to the United States, and assist some in preparing and filing their applications for asylum. And our affiliates continue to support folks that are now coming into the United States. With the Afghan response, we work very closely with USCCB. I still remember Bill calling me in late August and asking me if I could go to Fort Lee in Texas the next day just to assess the situation. You know, my initial response, I took a deep breath and I thought, wow, my calendar's full next week. And then I exhaled and I said, yes. And I think Bill described that that's what all the Catholic partners did. We realized this was a time in our history that we had to respond. And I'm grateful to Bill and his leadership he provided, and to USCCB for giving us that opportunity. So we do a lot of practical things, folks. One of the things we did immediately, we assessed some of the legal work, the needs, and then we created a resource page with the most up-to-date Afghan specific information and materials for attorneys and legal representatives. So they could use that. We also hosted special virtual workshops to better inform and support people helping Afghans resettle in the United States. We also produced a report based on the real world experience of our affiliates serving the Afghans. And working with USCCB, which does the advocacy at the federal level before the Congress. Clinic has encouraged its affiliates and wider networks to contact their representatives to say, please pass the Afghan Adjustment Act. So that's some of the work we did in terms of the Afghan response. Finally, I want to turn, before talking a little bit about faith, I want to turn to the deep need for increased immigration legal services. We've had the opportunity to work with Don and provide information and data along with other groups to start mapping out what are the immigration legal services need, what's the capacity out in the field, and what are the needs. It's been a pleasure to work with Don. That information is vital. It's vital for us to talk to funders, to talk to communities, to talk to parishes, to talk to our bishops, and to say, this is how many people there are, and this is what we have. Initial numbers suggest that there is one legal representative for 1,400 immigrants. So just imagine, folks, right? I want to work with my comms people to do a visual on that. So imagine if there's one legal representative for 1,400 people, how long will it take 1,301 to get a consultation, right? How do we triage? How do we identify who's first? So all those issues, 1 in 1,400. So there is a deep and significant need for us to increase and improve capacity for legal services. And it was, I think we spoke about this. I think that my colleagues here would agree. You know, you always feel the rush when you're serving, and many of you obviously in the audience, you always feel this rush, or I feel a daily rush that I have to keep going faster and faster to meet all the needs. Well, we can't meet all the needs. All we can do is the best we can, but we have to keep pushing. Our people that make decisions, work with our funders, work with our churches to increase and accompany our immigrant brothers and sisters in deeper and better ways. So finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about faith and how faith, there is a role for all of us to play based on faith. And as Christians, you know, we have a duty that's deeply enshrined in our gospel to welcome the strange in our midst. And today, what too many people fail to recognize is that the stranger sometimes doesn't look like us, right? Or pray like this, pray like us. And this has been apparent over the past year, particularly. So when I make these remarks, I want to say I'm really grateful for our response and our government's response. But why is it that the US was so quick to enact TPS for Ukrainians when we have thousands and thousands of men, women, and children along our southern border? Many of who have family members in the United States, many who have strong legitimate claims to asylum, who will enrich our country, and yet we're not responding to them in the ways that we responded to the Ukrainian situation. And we do know that our immigration system is fraught with racism. And it's our duty as people of faith to encourage our better angels to shine through. So often we discuss the border as the physical divider along the US-Mexico border, but a broader border we all need to address is the one within our hearts that prevents us from truly welcoming all who need it. So while I say this, yes, this does mean we should support the Ukrainians and the Afghans. Of course we should. Of course we should. And especially in moments like that happened in 2020 and 2021. However, it also means that we must take a deep breath, close our eyes, open our hearts, and look for solutions for the Central Americans coming to the southern border, the Haitians, people from all over the world who go through the Darien Pass and risk their lives, coming to the United States. They are coming because they're desperate and they must come to save their lives. So we must look for solutions for theirs as well. So I think I'll end there. And I was thinking, you know, one of the things we have to do is maybe just close our eyes and open our hearts. Just remind ourselves all the time, just close your eyes and open your hearts. And when I talk about this, I realize that this is difficult. There are large numbers. There are emergencies all around the world, but as people of faith, our first reaction must be to welcome all. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna and Bill and Barb, for just such insightful experiences and comments. And I would love to move into some Q&A right now. So Melissa's been monitoring the the online questions that we might have. Saul, do you have any for us?
Yeah, I have one. It says, what can we do regarding advocacy with the issues that you mentioned? And this is from Sister Rose.
So advocacy on, like, for example, like the Afghan Adjustment Act. Does anybody want to comment on that? I could take a stab at starting. Is Bill on?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh,
Certainly, certainly the Afghan Adjustment Act, which is hoped for legislation both in the House and Senate, perhaps to be attached to a reconciliation bill in the near future that will allow Afghans, a pathway to a permanent residency and perhaps citizenship in this country. Right now, each and every one of them has to go into basically an asylum process, some exceptions, but they go through an asylum process, which takes a tremendous amount of time, takes a tremendous amount of legal assistance, as Anna was talking about. This is unnecessary. So our organization, the Justice for Immigrants Coalition, a number of organizations, Clinic and others across the country are advocating, and people write their Congress folks to make sure this Afghan Adjustment Act gets introduced. That's one major current issue, among others. Thank you.
And actually, I would just like to follow up on the Afghan Adjustment Act and to answer Sister's question. What we've been heavily advocating for that in Boston, because for every asylum case that we do serve of the Afghans, that's 4 or 5 more people that might need an adjustment of status or to apply for citizenship or to apply for a work permit that we cannot serve. And so I almost think of the Adjustment Act as if it would pass as a force multiplier and a way to help our communities. Many communities stepped up and wanted to help Afghans, flung open their doors, provided us with copious amounts of financial resources and volunteer time. And now I'm asking those same people, okay, the next step is to raise your voice and advocate. And then hopefully they do raise that voice. And then the next time when we come to them and talk about TPS or comprehensive immigration form, if we're ever going to be able to talk about that again, they have a baseline and they have a face to remember that. And I think, Anna, what you're saying about we have to let our hearts be open to all faces and all people and all of their needs. And we can do this. We have to, though, help our communities to really understand the benefits and how by them raising their voice for others, it is just as helpful as writing a check. My CFO would not like me to say do one or the other, so I'll say writing the check and advocate, but it can be so powerful. So I'll stop here and other questions or other comments from the group or from the audience.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions from the audience? Raise your hand and I can bring the mic to you.
Yeah, I had I think a large question and a point too. We talk a lot about the legalization bills and the fact we haven't had a good legalization bill, but the Afghan Adjustment Act's a legalization bill. And the other point in its favor is it creates some momentum for additional legalization bills, right? So just to encourage kind of all of the great work you're doing and advocating for that. My question go to a couple of long challenges. One is I guess this is for Bill mostly, but kind of building back better or resuscitating the really decimated refugee resettlement infrastructure, kind of how's that going? What's the prognosis? Are more offices being added and all that? Because people don't realize the extent to which the program was decimated. And then the second is this issue of everybody that's arriving now seeking asylum, but a lot of them aren't going to get asylum, and it's going to take a long, long time anyway. And we've had some conversations about this, but the kind of the social service approach to these people, you know, and the legal approach as well, because this is like a huge challenge for the church. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. Can I take that one? So, Don, the resettlement system, first of all, you know, I want to make one comment from a Catholic and a Catholic Charities perspective. While resettlement programs ended in a number of offices, those offices stayed open and they continued to provide all sorts of services to Catholic Charities: housing, mental health, food assistance, legal clinics, etc. So when some of my colleague agencies talked about it being decimated, I saw it more kind of slightly asleep in waiting. And in fact, that was proven when we, you know, went from 40 agencies to 65 almost overnight, as long as, you know, the US government was able to provide some support. So the Catholic system came back very quickly and can grow very quickly. Some of the other agencies, I think, where they had sort of mono offices focused perhaps only on refugee resettlement, they were more, I think, touched by the resettlement cutbacks with that Trump did. The other point of this is that Trump administration cut a lot of staff who go overseas and adjudicate refugees. And COVID, of course, cut a lot of missions. Even recently, a mission to Turkey, almost all the US government employees came down with COVID while they were on the mission. So COVID still affects us, but the US Department of Homeland Security and State Department are rebuilding those teams, and those teams are going to be heading out, and we should see increases in refugee admissions in the future. Don, you also bring up asylum and asylum seekers, and I just want to say that the most needy immigrant in the country is an asylum seeker. We help them get across the border with some short-term respite care. They go into the country. Our legal agencies, both Catholic and otherwise, try mostly in a pro bono sense to assist them. The Catholic charities with little money try to help them out. But those asylum seekers who come into our country legally and who are welcomed by us by both law and in our spirit of America, they're in a really, really tough place. And we have to find ways to assist them both more with government resources and private resources. Don, I hope that answered a couple of your questions.
I just have a comment, something to add to that, but then also I have a question for Barb. But I was thinking too, so thinking about capacity and prioritizing the clinic, and I'm sure at the Phillies, especially at that level, you have so many different populations, so many different needs, responding always to, you know, the most impacted, the most vulnerable, and then are there other opportunities? So right now, 2 million plus people in the United States are eligible for some form, for lawful status, 2 million. And during the Trump administration, people were afraid to go for consultations. They were afraid to apply for anything. You know, sort of pulled back into themselves, right? So we have 2 million people that are eligible. How do we reach them? How do we provide consultations for them? And how do we support them? One of the things that Clinics has been doing is we've been talking to funders and groups of funders about this and identifying, you know, urging them to fund legal services organizations and identify those folks and get those folks started on the way before perhaps an unfriendly administration starts again and people become fearful, even though they do have a right. So it's sort of like this is a legalization too, as Don is talking about the Adjustment Act being a legalization, but this is a legalization as well. So how do we come together and do that? How do we work with funders? How does Clinic, and we already are starting to talk to funders and say, hey, you've got to give support and money to folks so we can start this as we're also helping the impacted and the most vulnerable. And then I have a question for Barb. For example, I love the YouTube, Know Your Rights, all the information that you're sharing at the different capacities, TikTok, PowerPoint, and then us old folks speaking. And but how, when you, and especially when you demonstrate that information goes to asylum seekers, immigrants, etc., how do you address capacity? Do they come to you? So tell me a little bit about, does the capacity increase?
The capacity has been really hard to deal with because we're probably turning down 4 asylum seekers a day, mainly Central American. And the hard thing for a lot of those people is there's no question they are terrified to go home, but they don't understand that being afraid to go home is not enough. You have to tie it to something called a protected ground. And they don't know that. And they can certainly, when they're caught at the border, voice a credible fear, but they can't tie it to one of the 5 protected grounds. And that's one of the things I think that we need to do, is maybe do a better job of educating people at the border about, okay, this is what your fear interview is going to be. This is what you need to establish, because it's not that they don't have it, they just don't know how to give it a voice. But my hope is that, my perfectly self-serving hope is, if this Afghan asylum project goes well, that then we will go on to doing a citizenship pro bono, and that charities in La Crosse and Green Bay and our charities and the group in Madison can work on doing those kind. Citizenship's a pretty discrete process. It's a year, but it's incredibly important for refugees because it's how they keep their public benefits. Unlike most immigrants, they do get public benefits for 7 years and then they get nothing. They lose their health insurance, their food share, they lose everything. And then if that goes well and the attorneys have a good experience doing that, feel that they get enough support, that then we could maybe move on to doing the VAWAs and the U's. I don't know that we can do the asylum because it just takes I've had an asylum client who applied for asylum, took so long, met someone, got married, got a conditional card, lived to the conditions of his card, waited out the citizenship time, got his US citizenship, and he abandoned his asylum claim at a swearing-in ceremony. So I don't know that I'm going to get private bar to do the asylum stuff. And the Afghans are a whole different thing, but I think we can get them to do some of the U's and the VAWAs and the citizenship, because realistically, if you do mergers and acquisitions all day, how emotionally rewarding is that? We had a woman doing actuarial defense all day. I'm like, that's nothing. You go home and go, yay, like good me. But if you help a person who now can tuck her kids at home at night and she's safe and she's away from the abuser, that you can feel good about.
Thank you, Barb. And I was thinking, as you're talking, unfortunately, because we do have a broken system, and it doesn't either implement the laws on the books to protect people, or the laws aren't adequate to protect people, everything seems to go through the asylum system, right? So while many of those cases actually may have a basis for asylum, some of those cases are so complicated, they require really experienced lawyers to make the case. And to do that, there's not that many, there's just not enough capacity, right? So unfortunately, we're pushing everything through the asylum pipeline when, for example, we have temporary protected status when people are here, and we don't robustly use that as we should. So that's that's what Clinic does. We do our advocacy around that, but it's disappointing. It's disappointing because it feels like our asylum system is just faltering and on its knees. Yes.
Okay, sorry, just a quick question, because I work in a kind of a small Catholic Charities office, but we're already getting questions from our Ukrainian clients, how they seek renewal of their parole, and they've just gotten here, and we have no idea who to turn to. So if any of the 3 of you could answer that, how we keep up on the status of that stuff,
So what I'm going to recommend is you go to Clinic's website and then you put in parole, and there'll be tools and information and how to there. And there'll probably likely be a webinar or trainings on it as well. Yeah.
And if you're a clinic affiliate, you can sign up for a daily newsletter from them, and they'll scan the different newspaper articles, but then also have put out information that's pretty timely and you need to know. I know we probably at least 2 or 3 times a week, we post one of their articles on our Facebook page or whatever. But those are great things, like when you get to the office in the morning, to click on that email that'll come overnight, and like the stuff that I need to know about that will be on that.
I'm just going to say thank you for promoting us.
Yeah, and I will promote Clinic forever. Attorney of the Day is also a really good resource that Clinic offers as well. So stay tuned. I'm sure there will be some webinars on Ukrainians.
I've often said, if you're young and starting out, Clinic is much better than AILA, because you can call the clinic and the technical support all the time. You can only call AILA so often before they stop picking up the phone, your colleagues. But I called so often when we first started that Charles Wheeler said it just wouldn't be Wednesday if you didn't call, because I called them all the time.
Oh, well.
Oh, we have the virtual participants. So the question is, do any of you have a big picture, vision, dream, strategy for increasing availability of immigration legal services at the border or around the country?
So, well, let me take a step back. You know, when emergency situations happen, we go into emergency mode, right? And our lane is, how do we deal with this emergency today or tomorrow? And how are we going to serve people in a week? We have to, at the same time, be having a mid and long-term vision. So Clinic, not everybody, in order to represent immigrants and asylum seekers before USCIS or the immigration courts, you do not have to be a lawyer. Okay. There's a program, the Department of Justice Recognition and Accreditation Program, 60 years old. It's a program where the Department of Justice recognizes a nonprofit organization has the ability to represent and provide immigration legal services. And then they accredit, and applicants for accreditation, meaning to become an accredited rep, can apply to become an accredited rep. That means a non-lawyer legal representative, skilled and expert in immigration matters. And so they have partial accredited reps that go to immigration for paperwork, and then full accredited reps that go to the courts. So our vision is, Clinic has 2,300 accredited reps right now. Our vision is to double that. We would like to double that within the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, it's very ambitious, but the truth is there are not enough attorneys to represent low income or middle income immigrants to reach and provide all those services. And there are accredited reps or individuals who are skilled in immigration, work with nonprofits, have a special commitment, and stay in their communities. So they stay and live in their communities. There's information, and go to Clinic and you can find it, but that's our vision. I mean, if we can significantly increase at the same time we're responding to the daily and the weekly needs and the emergency needs, to work towards increasing and creating an immigration legal services core of accredited reps, thousands and thousands across the country, because we will need them and this country needs them.
I have a dream. This is Bill. An individual, a kind of obscure chap, just dropped a 1.6 billion donation into the laps of an organization, run essentially by a chap who worked historically with the Federalist Society. I hope or dream that some good chap will drop $1.6 billion into the legal and asylum support system in this country to make life minimally acceptable for asylum seekers as they seek to live in our country. Thank you.
Well, on that note.
We have another question. How do we best engage those, including Catholics, who disagree with the church's position on migration? How do we remove the barriers in their hearts?
I'll just quickly, we need to tell more stories. I'm going to pass this to Barbara, but we just need to tell more stories. We need to bring immigrants and refugees to communities and to parishes, and we need to tell more stories. I mean, that's just a start. Other things.
The popes and the bishops have been really powerful, eloquent voices for the immigrant community. And I don't know what got me this, but I decided for Migration Week, we're going to turn to Migration Month. And we've been posting a Pope quote a day, primarily from St. John Paul II, because I think the people who are most uncomfortable with the message would be most comfortable getting it from him. But we posted, he's got a great thing about in fidelity to Christ's teaching itself, you must welcome the undocumented. And that's not mincing words. So we've been putting one of those out a day. We're going to include Benedict and Francis, but I think so in my grandiose moments, I would love to do a thing on Catholic social teaching and immigration and make it available to the parishes that they could use as they want to. I think part of the problem with the parishes is that they see a lot of immigrant people want to do reform as being kind of hostile and aggressive and in your face. But if you tie it to Catholic social teaching and you leave it there for people and not just slam it in their face, but let it look at it, I think it's pretty hard to ignore. I did try to get into our parishes in the Archdiocese to talk about Catholic social teaching and immigration, and no one said no, but nobody let me in. They just kept like hemming and hawing and yeah, I'll get back to you, and like nobody ever let me in. And I did their visas. So like I've got their cell phones. I'm their lawyer. If they're a foreign-born attorney, like I'm their lawyer and I can't get in. So, but I would love to try to do something like that with the social concerns committees and talk about, there's Catholic social teaching that's great stuff. If you're my age, you got Baltimore Catechism, you don't know any Catholic social teaching. But if you get to it, it's great stuff.
You know, this is a bill, just to add, and Don Kerwin and CMS has done some of this work on the contributions that immigrants make in this country, including asylum seekers, et cetera, the taxes they pay, the jobs that they take. We saw during COVID what essential workers were doing for the country, and a high percentage of those workers are immigrants. On the Justice for Immigrant JFI Coalition website, you'll see a paper that we did that attempted to provide some facts about immigration to help those who want to sort of defend immigration that they could turn to also. Aside from the good stories Anna mentioned, I think some facts are also available to support continued robust immigration in our country.
I think we have time for just one more question. The question is, where is the best place to use my skills as a newly trained DOJ rep who has not been accredited yet?
Well, if you're from Philly, Catholic Charities Philadelphia.
If I understand the question, the Catholic Legal Immigration Network does a training for becoming a rep. So there's two kinds of rep, level 1 and level 2. Level 1 goes to USCIS, level 2 can go to the court. They've got the training modules you can take. They've got a whole series of trainings you can take.
But we also have to be careful that if you are accredited rep has got to be associated with an accredited agency like a Catholic Charities. So perhaps you've had some training and you've done the training on your own, which is really commendable, but you'll need to be either employed or brought on as a, an intern and vetted with a Catholic Charities agency or another agency that is a DOJ accredited agency. So I applaud the effort, and they're definitely needed, but seek out a local program.
And where can they find the list of programs?
On your website.
Oh. So you can find the list of the accredited programs on our website or at the DOJ EOIR website. And there is a huge, huge need. There are jobs available. There are openings. Please look at the list and apply. You are welcome and you are needed. Okay.
Not only telling stories to the people, the priests have to hear these stories. The bishops have to hear these stories. A few years ago, I think the bishops, I think they were all Latino bishops. I hope I don't get in trouble, but I don't work in this country. Took a trip to the Holy Land. And I talked to London, I said, you should take a trip to the borderland. And he said, you're right. So I'm still waiting for his call.
And I would just add one more thing. I think words matter. And I think a well-intentioned and good Catholic use words like illegals or other words to describe our immigrant brothers and sisters. So it's one thing to think about in clinic. We're thinking about putting together a cheat sheet on, how we speak about our immigrant brothers and sisters. So thank you.
And I'll add just one more on that topic. The encountering is so important to changing hearts and minds. We are in a very dedicated effort at Catholic Charities of Boston to increase what we call community sponsorships. And when a parish or a synagogue or a mosque has the opportunity to welcome a family into their midst and really get to know them, it does start to convert. I mean, you have some people that are still very skeptical, or some people that'll say, well, I just want to help a refugee, but I don't want to help the migrant. But once people meet and can see our similarities instead of our differences, can see that we are also parents who have children to enroll into school, and we have those same struggles. So many Catholic charities across the countries are really working very hard through their refugee and immigration programs to build up what we call community sponsorships. And so I would look at some of those also as opportunities to direct people to, because until we start to really interact and talk to one another, we're not going to be able to break down some of those barriers. And I know we are getting very late on time, but I'm enjoying this discussion. So we should go ahead and wrap now, but thank you all very much. And thank you to my amazing panelists, Bill, Barb, and Anna. It's just been an honor and a pleasure to be here with you. And thank you so much for sharing with us. And thank you all. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So coming up next, we're going to treat you to some musical and artistic performances. The first performance we'll see is a poetry reading from Saul Lopez. He's a student at Marquette University, and we're going to just show his video recording now.
Buenas tardes. My name is Saul Lopez. I am a third-year PhD student in the College of Education studying educational policy and leadership. And I was invited to read some of my poetry for today's conference, and it's a great honor of mine to be here. Although I can't be here physically because I have class right now, I recorded a set of poems that I think inhabit the themes of the conference, the themes of who I am as a poet, and I think really encapsulates my own experience as a son of immigrants and a Mexican poet living in Milwaukee. Before I begin, I want to thank the Center for Migration Studies, the Center for Peacemaking here at Marquette, all of you for attending, all the moderators, all the panelists, everyone who made this event possible. Thank you. This first poem is called Dear Lourdes, Querida Lourdes, and it's my imagining, my poetic retelling of how my dad must have seen Milwaukee when he first arrived and described it to my mother, who at the time was in Mexico before they moved over here. He came in the 90s and then went back and married my mother. And this poem is kind of my imagination of how he must have seen Milwaukee. And in a letter form. Dear Lourdes, it's not bad here in Milwaukee, I promise. You'll like the lake. It's called Michigan. I run there all the time. There's so many people. They look really nice. Only some of them will call you names, but most of them will say hi. There's a big market where they sell a lot of food. I like to think there. It makes me think of you. There's a huge white building, a skyscraper. I see it all the time when I go to work. Work is tough, but I like it. I burn metal and make new metal. It's like working inside a volcano. There's a lot of cheese and a lot of beer. They really love it here, and they wear green and gold every Sunday. I got you a shirt that says Favre. You'll see it once you cross. This next poem is called Home is Here, and it is dedicated to all of the activists, all of the advocates, all of the documented students we have here in the US. This is a homage to all of the hard work and all the battles and struggles and the continuing struggle to obtain a humane immigration reform here in the United States. It's called Home is Here. A miracle born in the midst of a storm, a dream planted along treacherous journeys, a flower that wasn't supposed to grow but has blossomed despite the lack of a loving soil, a flower that converts hate into nourishment, fear into perseverance, prejudice into fuel, a flower that lives in between borders, singing stories, tales imprinted on the pronunciations of our names, on the accents that color our shared humanidad. A flower whose roots sprouted here, a flower that is shouting, home is here, de aquí no nos vamos. This next poem and the last poem I'll be reading today is called Mi Frontera Lingüística. And the backstory of this poem is that for a long time I had two sets of notebooks. I had an English notebook and a Spanish notebook where I wrote in one language and then I wrote in another. And it was tough to keep separating both, right? It was this sense of like, I can't cross these two languages. But one day I just couldn't, right? And this is a love letter to language, a love letter to bilingualism. And it's my way of saying, you can't put each language in a box. It's called Mi Frontera Lingüística. El lenguaje no conoce frontera, yet we want people to pay for our mistakes. Para recitar un soneto de amor bajo una noche estrellada, one mustn't show a valid form of ID. I have faced no charge for this unholy matrimonio de dos lenguas, ya bastardas, llenas de sangre, guerra, revolución y un poco de deceits. Ya es el pensamiento impuro que I have to decide which one to pick and which one to forget. Pero es tan corta la vida y tan larga la ignorancia que me rehúso a soltar my two sets of alphabets, one with an extra letra or two. Porque no es lo mismo leer un soneto de Shakespeare en español y mucho menos un soneto de Neruda en inglés. Mientras se pueda, both languages must learn to respect their differences y aprender uno del otro, because a day will come where ninguno de los dos will be used, for once we die, la muerte nos muestra el lenguaje de la vida. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure of mine to share my poetry. I hope you have a wonderful end of your day, and thank you.